The darkness was complete when you first stirred, a deep and silent black that filled the small sleeping cell from floor to ceiling. There was no window open to the sky, only a high narrow slit that looked out onto a covered portico, and at this hour not even the faintest hint of dawn could find a way through the thick stone walls. You had been dreaming something formless, a drifting sense of movement without destination, but that dissolved the instant your mind brushed against wakefulness. Beneath the rough wool blanket, your body lay still on the thin straw mattress, the stuffing compacted over many nights into a shallow nest that fit the curve of your spine. The blanket's coarse fibers scratched lightly against your chin as you turned your head, and the weight of it dragged across your shoulders in a way you had long ceased to notice. Its warmth was a familiar presence, almost a second skin, and you did not push it away yet. Instead, you let your breathing fall into alignment with the slow, steady tide of breath that rose and fell around you. The communal sigh of a dozen sleeping men. Each exhale seemed to blend into the next, a continuous murmur like wind moving through a distant grove, while the occasional deeper breath from one corner or another broke the pattern only slightly before the rhythm mended itself. The sound was so woven into the silence that you could not tell where one ended and the other began. In the far corner, someone shifted, the straw rustling for a moment before settling back into silence, and the noise was as gentle as a stone dropped into still water, its ripples swallowed almost instantly. You kept your eyes closed for a little longer, letting the stillness hold you, listening not for any particular noise, but for the absence of noise, the deep quiet of the ludus before the day began. The air was cool and still, tasting faintly of old stone and the last traces of olive oil from the lamp that had been extinguished hours ago, a scent that lingered without asserting itself. More memory than substance. Somewhere beyond the thick walls, the city of Rome lay asleep, its streets empty, its fountains murmuring to themselves, its hills dark under a sky that had not yet remembered it was morning. You had no need to rush. The training ground beneath the arena would be empty and waiting whenever you arrived, and the darkness here was as patient as it was complete. So you let your body settle deeper into the mattress, feeling the give of the straw beneath your hips and shoulders, the slight resilient push that answered your weight, and for a time you simply existed in that half space between rest and purpose. Eventually, though, the familiar signals of waking passed through your limbs, a slight stiffness in the shoulder pressed against the mattress, a dry warmth in your mouth, the cool air on your face when you turned your head away from the blanket. The feeling of drowsiness was not so much leaving as thinning, becoming transparent enough that the shapes of the room began to form behind your eyelids, and you knew without urgency that it was time to open your eyes. When you did, the darkness seemed to have softened just enough to distinguish the lumpen shapes of the other sleeping men, their forms like low hills under their own blankets. The cell was small, its stone walls close and comforting, and the space between the low ceiling and the floor felt almost like a cocoon, sealed off from the immense night outside. A wooden shelf ran along one side, holding a few clay cups and the water jug, their outlines barely visible as slightly denser patches of black. You pushed the blanket down slowly, the wool catching on your tunic with a faint whisper, and the colder air met your chest like a gentle reminder of the hour. The difference in temperature was not unpleasant, merely present, a quiet signal that it was time to move. Your hands rested on the edge of the mattress, the coarse weave of the straw cover pressing into your palms, and you sat up carefully, the movement a smooth unfolding of the spine. The straw crunched softly beneath your shifting weight, a sound so familiar that it was almost a form of silence, a background note that had been present every morning since you could remember. Your feet found the floor, the stone cool and smooth under the soles, worn by many years of bare footsteps before yours. The surface was not polished, but had a velvety quality from the countless oils of skin, and it seemed to welcome your touch without a hint of chill. You sat like that for a while, shoulders relaxed, head slightly bowed, feeling the floor's steady coolness draw the last remnants of sleep from your skin. There was no urgency. In the breathing darkness, time was measured not by the water clock, but by the gradual easing of stiffness from your legs and the slow clearing of your thoughts. The tunic you slept in was a simple sleeveless garment of undyed wool, its texture soft with age and repeated washings, and now you drew its folds more closely around you, the fabric settling against your collarbone and upper arms with the lightness of a second skin. Standing came next, a gentle unfolding of the body that you performed without thinking. One knee unbent, then the other, until you were upright and the blanket pooled on the mattress behind you. The floor seemed to hold you with a slight resilience, the subtle give of the packed earth beneath the stone, and you stood motionless, listening again to the breathing of the others, which had not changed its pace. In the darkness, you could almost believe that the whole city was a single living creature, breathing slowly through its many windows and doorways. The water jug sat on the shelf as it always did, a squat vessel with a narrow mouth and two small handles, its surface worn smooth by countless hands over the years. You moved toward it with the careful step of someone who knows the space so well that sight is unnecessary, your bare feet making no sound on the stone until you had crossed the few strides to the shelf. Your fingers found the clay lip, cool and slightly rough with tiny irregularities from the potter's wheel, and you tilted the jug carefully over one of the cups. The thin trickle of water clear in the quiet, each drop sounding like a tiny chime against the larger silence. The stream caught the faintest possible light from somewhere, a brief glisten before it disappeared into the cup. You filled the cup halfway and set the jug back down, the base meeting the shelf with a soft thud. Lifting the cup with both hands, you felt the coolness seep into your palms, a sensation that was half temperature and half texture, the unglazed clay absorbing the warmth of your skin while the water inside remained cold. The first sip washed the dryness from your mouth, a clean, simple taste that was the same as every other morning, an absence of flavor that was somehow refreshing, like drinking pure stillness. You drank the rest in slow swallows, the water tracing a cool path down your throat and settling gently in your stomach, where it seemed to spread a calm alertness through your middle. A second cup was poured and sipped more slowly, and by the time it was empty and returned to the shelf with a soft click, your body felt fully awake, though your mind still floated in that gentle fog that made the pre-dawn hours feel separate from ordinary time. The air in the cell seemed a little less stale now, or perhaps you were simply more aware of its movement, a slight current that brushed against your cheeks as you turned back toward the mattress. This current carried the same faint oil scent, but now with a hint of something green, perhaps the damp from outside finding its way through the narrow window slit. You reached for your sandals, which lay on the floor beside the mattress. The leather straps coiled loosely like a sleeping animal. The act of picking them up was unhurried, your fingers tracing the familiar smoothness of the soles, the slight stiffness of the straps from the previous day's sweat and dust. You sat down again on the edge of the mattress, sandals in your lap, and began to fit them to your feet one at a time. The leather sole was cool against your skin, shaped by your own weight over many months, and you aligned your heel with its shallow depression, a perfect negative of your foot. The surface was darker where your arch pressed hardest, and the edges were softened, almost furry. The straps passed between your first and second toes, the thin leather still supple from use, and then back around the ankle. You tied each one with a simple knot, not too tight, testing the give with a small flex of your foot that caused the sole to bend obediently. The second sandal was fitted with the same careful attention, the loop wrapped twice around the heel before being secured, and you tugged the final knot gently to confirm its hold, the leather rasping softly against itself. The floor felt different now, the sandals creating a slight gap between you and the stone, and the air around your ankles was immediately warmer, as if the leather had gathered a residual heat from the day before. You spent a moment adjusting the straps of both sandals, ensuring that no edge rubbed uncomfortably, your fingers tracing the familiar path along the side of your foot, and then stood up once more, the soles giving a faint tap on the stone that echoed in the small cell. The high narrow window in the far wall still revealed nothing but a dense grey that was almost the same as the darkness. You could tell that outside the sky must be beginning to thin, but only just, the barest dilution of black with something softer, a promise of light that had not yet arrived. No bird calls, no carts, no murmur of early risers in the street below. The world above was a held breath. The silence was so complete that the soft scuff of your sandals on the stone seemed like a disruption, a small sound that fell into the well of quiet and vanished instantly. Yet the others slept on without stirring, their breathing as steady as the tide. You gathered your tunic's folds one more time, ensuring the fabric was not twisted, the wool hanging straight over your shoulders and hips, and moved toward the door of the sleeping cell. It was a heavy wooden panel that stood slightly ajar, its surface rough with age, grain raised in places where dampness had worked its way in over the years. The iron latch was cold under your fingers. You pushed it open with your fingertips, feeling the slight resistance before it swung inward with a low, long creak that seemed to hang in the air before fading into the corridor beyond. The opening darkness was even deeper there, the kind that fills enclosed spaces where no lamp has burned for hours, and you paused on the threshold, letting the slight movement of air bring you the smells of the corridor, old wood, a trace of cooking ash from the kitchen down the way, and the faint mineral scent of the stone itself, a smell like dried rain. That composite odor was as familiar as your own skin, and it greeted you without expectation. You stepped through the doorway and into the passage, the immediate feeling of the larger space one of cooler air and a subtle echo. Your footsteps, though light, bounced back from unseen walls with a soft pattering reverberation that gave you the measure of the space, telling you that the ceiling here was higher and the walls farther apart. You knew this passage well, its length and its turnings, the location of the small stairs that led down to the latrine, the niche where a small household shrine sat with its tiny clay figures whose features were worn smooth by the touch of many hands over time. You did not need to see any of it. Your body remembered the distances as a form of habit, the way a bird remembers its migratory path, or water remembers how to find the lowest ground. The floor here was made of the same worn stone, slightly uneven in places where the slabs had settled, and you walked a few paces before stopping because there was no reason to hurry. A bench sat against the wall, a simple plank of wood resting on two stone supports, its surface polished by the friction of generations of seated men. You lowered yourself onto it, the wood cold through your tunic in an instant, and leaned your back against the wall. The wall was rougher than the one in the cell, its surface pitted and uneven from the original chiseling, and through the thin fabric you could feel each chip and ridge as a small point of pressure. The weight of the entire building seemed to press gently from above, the many floors of the insula rising from the street, beams and mortar and tiles that had stood for decades layered one upon another. That weight was not a burden, but a kind of shelter, the accumulated mass of the structure holding the night still, and you felt it as a steady presence against your spine. The air moved slowly in the corridor, a faint current that brought the cooler breath of the street, carrying with it the distant, almost imagined scent of dew on cobblestones. It was the same air that would soon fill the arena's undercroft, and you breathed it in without thinking. Here, in the darkness of the corridor, you were suspended between the day that had passed and the day that was to come, a small figure in a vast and quiet complex. The breathing of the other gladiators was now a distant murmur behind the closed door, a reminder of a shared purpose that did not need to be spoken. Their rest continuing without you. You allowed yourself a few more minutes of stillness, hands resting loosely on your knees, palms turned upward, eyes open to the featureless black. The thought of the arena was a presence in your mind, not a call to action, but a familiar destination you would reach in time, as naturally as water finds its own level. Its underground passages and empty sand waited with the same patience as this bench, and you could almost feel the coolness of its deeper dark reaching out to meet you. The corridor continued away to your left, toward the main hall and the outer door that led to the street, and you could sense its pull as a quiet expectation, but you did not rise yet. Instead, you closed your eyes for a moment, not because you were tired, but to experience the darkness more completely, the unlit space behind your eyelids merging with the unlit space of the ludus until the two were one continuous room. When you opened them again, nothing had changed, and that was perfectly fine. The building settled around you, its stones crackling faintly as the cool air pressed inward from the approaching dawn, each small noise a punctuation in the long sentence of the night. Somewhere a door creaked in the distance, a sound so muted it might have been imagination, but it required no attention. You were here, awake and still, in the heart of the sleeping school, and that was enough for now. Eventually you would rise from the bench and follow the corridor toward the outer door, stepping into the empty street that led to the arena. The stones would be cool under the open sky and the first thin light would be waiting above the rooftops. But that moment was not yet here. For now the bench held you in its quiet, and the darkness wrapped around you like another blanket, patient and undemanding. The night was long and you were in no hurry. Every small step you had taken from waking to this seat had been part of the same unbroken quiet, and you moved through it as though through water, slowly and without disturbance. The weight of the building, the coolness of the air, the distant breathing of your companions all formed a single seamless presence that asked nothing of you but to be here, and so you remained at rest in the deep corridor, letting the silence fill the spaces between your heartbeats until the time to leave arrived on its own. The door from the ludus swung outward without resistance, and you stepped from the enclosed corridor into a space that felt immediately larger, as though the world had exhaled around you. The street was narrow, barely wide enough for two carts to pass if they squeezed close to the walls, but at this hour it held nothing but the darkness thinning into a deep, colorless grey. The cobblestones met your sandals with a cool, faintly damp texture, the kind of moisture that gathered in the hours before dawn when the sky had not yet decided to release its dew, and each step produced a soft scuffing sound that travelled only a short distance before being swallowed by the high walls on either side. You stood for a moment just beyond the threshold, letting the door close behind you with a gentle click of its latch, and the sound of the mechanism was the only sharp noise in a world otherwise made of whispers. Above, the strip of sky visible between the rooftops was a seamless grey veil without stars or clouds, its colour so uniform that it might have been painted by a single steady hand. The insulae rose 4 and 5 stories on both sides, their brick facades darkened by the night and their wooden shutters all drawn tight, each window a closed eye that gave nothing away. No light leaked from any crack, no voices drifted down from the upper floors. The entire population of this district remained suspended in the last deep hour of sleep, and you moved through their dreams as a silent bystander. The air carried a coolness that was not quite cold, a freshness that seemed to rise from the stones themselves, tinged with the mineral scent of dried rain and the faintest trace of wood smoke from a hearth long extinguished. You turned left as you always did and began to walk. Your pace was unhurried, a steady rhythm of soles on stone that you had learned over countless mornings, until it became as automatic as breathing. The street ran straight for a while before bending slightly to follow the contour of the hill, and as you walked you could feel the slight incline underfoot, a gentle slope that asked nothing of your legs but provided a subtle reminder of the city's uneven ground. The buildings on your right belonged to a row of shops at street level with living quarters above, their fronts closed by heavy wooden shutters that reached from the stone threshold to the lintel, each panel fitted into grooves worn smooth by daily sliding. You passed a fuller's establishment, its characteristic scent of urine and clay still clinging faintly to the closed doorway despite the night's airing, an earthy smell that mingled with the general coolness without overwhelming it. Next came a potter's shop, where stacks of unpainted bowls and pitchers were just visible through the gaps in the shutters, their rounded shapes like a collection of pale moons in the darkness. The counter where they sold their wares was a simple stone slab extending into the street, now empty and swept clean, its surface cool and dust-free. Your footsteps resonated differently here, bouncing between the close walls with a slightly hollow quality before the sound escaped upward into the open air above the roofline. You had passed this same counter many times, yet each morning it appeared slightly different as the changing angle of the grey sky revealed new faint details, a chip in the stone edge, a scatter of fine clay powder, the ghost of a handprint left by a hurried shopkeeper. The street widened slightly as you approached a small intersection where a narrow alley branched off to the right, little more than a slit between two apartment blocks, its darkness still absolute. From its depths came a soft sound, the shifting of a dog turning in its sleep, a brief rustle followed by a contented sigh that quickly faded. The dog, a familiar stray that roamed the neighborhood by day and found shelter in that alley by night, did not stir as you passed, and you did not look directly into the darkness, but simply noted the sound as part of the morning's texture. A few paces beyond the intersection, the bakery announced itself by a rich, yeasty aroma that hung in the air like a warm blanket, the smell of yesterday's bread still radiating from the cooling ovens built into the back wall. The shop front was larger than its neighbours, its counter a wide stone slab that would later hold rounds of flatbread and small loaves, but now it was empty except for a single clay mixing bowl turned upside down and a dusting of flour that had settled on every surface like a fine, pale powder. You inhaled as you passed, and the scent was so dense you could almost taste it, the faint tang of sourdough from a starter that had been kept alive for generations, and the deeper note of toasted grain from the oven bricks themselves. The aroma seemed to warm the air by a degree or two, and for a few strides you walked through a pocket of unexpected comfort before the street opened again, and the coolness returned. On your left now rose the long flank of a private house, its windowless ground floor faced with small squared stones set in a neat pattern, the kind of construction that spoke of modest wealth and a desire for privacy. Above the stonework, the second story projected outward slightly, supported by a few corbels, and the overhang created a shadow that even the growing dawn could not reach. You walked through that shadow and noticed the change in temperature on your bare arms. A slight drop that raised the fine hairs and then passed as you emerged into the open air again. Ahead, a public fountain stood at the next corner, its basin a large rectangular trough of travertine fed by a bronze spout in the shape of a lion's head, the metal green with age. The fountain was silent now, its water turned off during the night hours to conserve pressure in the aqueducts, but the basin still held a shallow pool from the previous day, its surface perfectly still and reflecting the grey sky with such fidelity that it looked like a polished metal mirror set into the stone. You paused by the fountain for a moment, not because you were tired, but because the stillness of the water invited a pause, and you rested one hand on the cool rim of the basin while your breathing settled into the slower rhythm of your walk. The travertine was rough under your palm, filled with tiny cavities that felt like a sponge made of stone, and the coolness traveled up your wrist and into your forearm like a slow, pleasant current. After a brief rest, you pushed off and continued, your sandals now carrying a faint trace of moisture from the damp cobblestones near the basin that quickly dried as the street inclined upward again. The route you followed was one you knew so well that your body navigated it without conscious instruction, each turn anticipated by a subtle shift of weight astride before you reached it. The street narrowed where an ancient tenement had settled unevenly over the centuries, its wall bulging outward so that you had to walk closer to the opposite side, your shoulder nearly brushing the closed shutters of a wine shop. The scent here was different, a faint acidity of old wine that had soaked into the wooden casks stored within, and you could hear the slow tick of cooling staves contracting in the night air. A tiny sound like the tapping of a fingernail on wood, repeated at long intervals. Past the bulge, the street opened into a small square, where a single olive tree grew from a circular stone planter in the center, its branches a dark lace against the lightening sky. The tree was old and gnarled, its trunk twisted by many seasons, and a few fallen leaves lay scattered on the cobblestones around its base, their edges curled and brittle. The square was wide enough that your footsteps lost their echo and became instead a soft padding that spread outward and died without reflection, absorbed by the open space. Around the square, the buildings maintained their closed facades, but here the architecture was a little more varied. A staircase visible through a recessed doorway, a small balcony with a withered plant trailing from a pot, a signboard depicting a large key that marked the location of a locksmith. All of it was motionless, all of it dim. From the square, you took the wider street that led directly toward the arena, its direction unmistakable, because the roadway began to curve gently in a great arc, following the outer perimeter of the massive oval structure that dominated this district. The air began to change as you drew nearer, and you noticed it first as a shift in the way sounds behaved, the distant scuff of your own feet suddenly acquiring a faint reverberation that had not been present before, as though a vast empty space ahead was already listening. The buildings on this street were lower and more utilitarian, stables and storage warehouses built of the same grey tufa blocks that formed the arena's foundation, their thick walls radiating the accumulated coolness of the night. Between two such warehouses, a narrow gap offered a brief glimpse of the arena wall itself, a curving expanse of travertine that rose straight up into the grey sky, its surface marked by the regular pattern of iron clamps that held the stones together. The wall disappeared from view as the gap closed and you continued along the curve, but its image remained in your mind like a quiet promise. Your pace did not quicken. There was no need to hurry toward something that would wait patiently, and the walk itself was the whole purpose of this hour. The slow transition from the closed warmth of the ludus to the vast contained stillness of the arena's undercroft. You passed a stable where a horse stamped once in its stall, the sound muted by straw and thick walls, and then a cartwright's workshop where the silhouette of a half-finished wheel leaned against the wall. The wheel's spokes cast a faint spiderweb shadow that moved imperceptibly as the sky above continued its slow brightening from deep grey to a paler shade, like water in which a single drop of milk had been dissolved. The change was so gradual that you could not identify the moment when it happened, only that by the time you reached the next landmark, a small shrine set into a niche where a clay lamp usually burned, but was now cold, the world was distinctly more visible. Details that had been hidden took shape: the grain of the wooden shutters, the worn edges of the stepping stones that served as a raised crossing point at the next intersection, the inscription on a public notice board whose letters you could not read from this distance, but whose uniform lines formed a rectangular block of text on the whitewashed surface. Each revelation was gentle, devoid of surprise, and you accepted it as you accepted the feel of your sandals against the stone. The street curved more sharply now, following the arena's outer ellipse, and the sense of a massive presence just out of sight intensified. The every dokkan a faintly different quality, cooler and slightly more damp, carrying a hint of the underground that you would soon enter. The scent of stone that had never known sunlight, and sand that had absorbed centuries of sweat and oil. This scent was subtle, not yet the full breath of the hypogeum, but its outer edge, the aroma of the arena's shadow reaching out like a cool hand. A cat, lean and grey, crossed the street ahead of you with the slow, deliberate gait of an animal that considered the entire city its territory, and it disappeared into a drain opening without sparing you a glance. The soft fall of its paws was the only movement in the street besides your own. You reached a small arched gate set into the outer wall of a service building that abutted the arena, the very gate you used each morning, its wooden surface studded with iron nails and set deeply into the stone. The wall here was rough, not dressed smooth like the public facades, and the stone blocks were larger, each one requiring 2 hands to span. You stopped before the gate and placed your palm flat against the wood, feeling the grain under your fingers, the slight give of ancient timber that had swollen and contracted through countless seasons, yet remained solid. The iron nails were cool and slightly rough with rust, and you could feel the pattern of their heads, each one slightly different from the next, a row of small cold domes under your fingertips. Standing there, you listened to the silence behind the gate, and the greater silence of the street you had just walked. No birds yet, no distant calls of street vendors, no rumble of wagon wheels. The city held its breath, and you held yours with it, suspended in the final moments before dawn would officially break over the hills. The sky above the arena wall was now pale enough to distinguish the outline of the upper seating tiers, a series of receding steps that climbed toward the rim, each one carved with the precision of a master stonemason. The travertine glowed faintly with a light that seemed to come from within, a trick of the atmosphere that made the stone look warm, even though it was cold to the touch. You dropped your hand from the gate and turned once to look back down the street you had traversed, but the view was already dissolving into the same grey haze, the buildings blending together into a single, continuous mass. The fountain, the bakery, the potter's shop, the swayback's tenement, the square with its olive tree, each of them had been real moments ago. Each had held your footsteps and given you their sense, and now they retreated into the formless background as though they existed only for your passage, and then vanished when no longer needed. You faced the gate again and placed both hands on the iron ring that served as a handle, a ring worn thin at its bottom curve from the grip of many hands over many years, and you pulled it gently toward you. The hinges gave a low, prolonged creak that echoed inside the passage beyond, a sound that seemed to welcome you back into the darkness beneath the stands, and you stepped forward without hesitation, leaving the empty street behind. The iron ring was cold and solid in your grip as you pulled the gate toward you, and the ancient hinges yielded with a long, low groan that seemed to rise from somewhere deep within the stonework. The sound traveled backward into the passage, bouncing off unseen walls and returning to you as a soft echo that faded only after you had already stepped across the threshold. The air inside was immediately different, cooler by several degrees and thick with a stillness that seemed to have been undisturbed for hours, perhaps days. It wrapped around your shoulders like a heavy cloak woven from the breath of old stone. You paused just inside, letting the gates swing shut behind you with a resonant thud that sealed away the street and its pale grey sky, and for a moment you stood in a darkness so complete that your eyes, still carrying the memory of the open air, could perceive nothing at all. The transition was gentle rather than jarring, a slow immersion into a world where light had to be earned step by step. The floor beneath your sandals was no longer the irregular cobblestone of the street, but smooth, worn flagstones set tightly together, their surfaces polished to a dull sheen by centuries of footfalls that had passed this way before you were born. You could feel the subtle slope of the floor angling downward, guiding you into the earth with the same quiet inevitability that a river follows its bed, and you began to walk forward into the darkness. One hand lifted slightly to brush the wall on your right. The wall was rough under your fingertips. The stone blocks left undressed in this service passage, their faces chiseled with the broad, functional strokes of laborers who had no need to impress. Mortar crumbled slightly in places, leaving a fine gritty dust that clung to your skin, and you could trace the outline of each block by the deep seams where the pointing had receded over time. The descent was gradual, a ramp rather than stairs, and your knees noted the change in angle as a slight additional effort on each step that was not unpleasant, merely present, a reminder that you were leaving the level of the street behind. After a few strides, the absolute darkness began to soften, and you became aware of a faint orange glow ahead, a warmth in the blackness that flickered almost imperceptibly. As you drew nearer, the source revealed itself to be an oil lamp set into a niche in the wall, its small flame dancing gently behind a shield of thin horn that diffused the light into a soft halo. The lamp was the first of many, you knew, placed at intervals along the descending passage, and each one burned with a tiny steady hiss that was more a texture in the silence than a true sound. You paused at the first lamp and looked at it for a moment, watching the way the flame leaned slightly toward you, as if acknowledging your presence, then straightened again as the draught you had brought with you settled. The horn shield was warm when you passed your palm near it, radiating a gentle heat that felt like the sun remembered rather than the sun experienced, and the light it cast was just enough to reveal the next few strides of the corridor before everything faded back into shadow. You continued downward, and as you walked the passage gradually widened, the walls receding until your outstretched hand could no longer touch the right side without leaning. The ceiling rose too, climbing from a height just above your head to something loftier, so that the sound of your footsteps changed from a muffled close echo to a more spacious resonance that suggested a large chamber somewhere ahead. The air grew more complex as you descended, layering the initial coolness with new scents that seemed to be released from the stone in slow waves. The faint smokiness of spent torch fuel, the dry mineral odor of ancient sand that had settled into every crack, and beneath these a deeper note of dampness that spoke of the water table far below, of underground springs and seepage that the builders had contended with. The lamp niches appeared at regular intervals now, and the passage became a tunnel of soft amber light that guided you forward without ever fully illuminating the space, creating an effect of walking through a dream where the path ahead was always just revealing itself and the path behind dissolved into a gentle haze. You passed an alcove where a stack of clay oil jars stood against the wall, their round bellies glazed with a dark slip that reflected the lamplight in dull gleams, and a wooden ladle hung from a nail beside them, ready for the attendant who would refill the lamps before the day's activities began. The smell of olive oil was strong here, a rich green scent that momentarily overlaid the stone and sand, and you breathed it in as you passed, the aroma filling your lungs with a sense of provision and care. The ramp ended at a level floor where the passage turned sharply to the left and widened into a broad vaulted corridor. This was the main artery of the Undercroft, a subterranean gallery that ran in a great curve beneath the seating tiers above, and its scale was such that a dozen men could have walked abreast without touching. The ceiling arched overhead, formed of large stone voussoirs that fitted together with the precision of a puzzle, their joints marked by thin lines of darker mortar. From the apex of each vault hung an iron bracket supporting a larger oil lamp, and these burned with a steadier, brighter flame than the passage lamps, their light pooling on the floor in overlapping circles of warm gold that left the spaces between them in a deep, velvety shadow. The floor here was covered with a layer of fine sand, not the deep sand of the arena above, but a thin scattering that had been carried in on countless pairs of sandals and had never been fully swept away. It crunched softly under your feet with a sound like the grinding of tiny seashells, and each step left a faint impression that would be erased by the next person to walk this way. You stopped at the threshold of the vaulted corridor and let the full presence of the space settle around you, a feeling of being held within the very bones of the arena, surrounded by the immense weight of stone and earth that rose above your head to support the tens of thousands of seats where, in a few hours, the crowds would gather. The stillness here was of a different order than the stillness of the street or the ludus. It was a dense, layered quiet that seemed to have accumulated over centuries, each day adding its own thin stratum of silence until the very air had become heavy with it. The flames of the overhead lamps burned without flickering, their steady glow a testament to the absence of any draught. And the only movement anywhere was the slow, lazy drift of dust motes that floated through the lamplight, like tiny creatures swimming in a golden sea. You watched them for a while, the way they rose and fell on invisible currents, clustering together then dispersing, their parts so unhurried that they seemed to exist outside the normal flow of time. The sound of your own breathing was the loudest thing in the corridor, a soft, rhythmic whisper that the vast space absorbed almost before it could reach your ears, and when you swallowed, the click in your throat was distinct and solitary. This was a place that demanded nothing, expected nothing, and seemed to exist solely for the purpose of waiting, and you felt your own internal rhythm slow to match its vast patience. Your heart, which had beaten at the gentle pace of your walk, now settled into an even deeper calm, each beat separated by a stretch of time that felt leisurely and full. To your left, a series of wooden benches lined the wall, their planks dark with age and polished by use, and beyond them a row of small storage rooms had been carved into the stone, their entrances arched and fitted with heavy timber doors that now stood slightly ajar. From one of these rooms came a faint smell of leather and oil, suggesting racks of equipment awaiting the morning, while another exuded the dry, papery scent of stored grain, perhaps feed for the animals that would later be led to the lifts. You walked past them slowly, noting each doorway and the particular shadow it cast, the way the darkness inside seemed to spill out a little way before being overtaken by the lamplight. The corridor continued its gentle curve, following the oval shape of the arena above, and you could feel the arc in the way your feet adjusted their angle slightly with each step, a subtle leaning into the turn that was almost imperceptible unless you paid attention. The walls here were punctuated at intervals by stout pillars that rose to meet the vault, their surfaces squared off and unadorned, and between them the stone had been plastered and whitewashed long ago, leaving a pale surface that caught and reflected the lamplight with a soft, creamy radiance. In places the whitewash had flaked away, revealing the grey tufa beneath, and these patches formed shapes that your mind could resolve into maps or animals if you let it. But you did not linger on them, simply registered their presence as part of the quiet tapestry of the place. You came at last to the entrance of the training area itself, a wide opening that led off the main corridor into a larger chamber where the ceiling rose higher still and the floor was entirely covered with a thick layer of sand. This was a dedicated practice space, separate from the staging areas where the wild animals and the elaborate scenery were kept. A place reserved for the gladiators who needed to work their drills in the cool darkness before the sun climbed too high. The entrance had no door, only a tall arched opening flanked by two pillars, and you stood in the archway, looking into the dimness beyond. The sand stretched away into the shadows, its surface raked smooth from the previous evening, a pale expanse that seemed to glow faintly with the reflected lamplight. Around the perimeter of the chamber, more lamps burned in niches, their flames smaller here and spaced farther apart, so that the center of the space lay in a gentle twilight, while the edges were picked out in warm detail. The walls of the chamber were bare stone, unplastered, their surfaces rugged and cool, and they rose straight up to a ceiling that you knew from memory was formed of heavy wooden beams supporting the floorboards of the arena level above. Those boards were thick and tightly fitted, but here and there a tiny thread of light would, later in the day, find its way through a knot or a crack, drawing a fine golden line across the darkness. Now, however, no light at all penetrated from above, and the chamber existed in a cocoon of its own making. You stepped through the archway and into the sand, which immediately yielded under your sandals with a soft welcoming give, and you felt the slight redistribution of grain beneath your soles as the fine particles flowed around the leather straps. The sand was cool, having held the temperature of the deep earth through the night, and it radiated that coolness up around your ankles, a sensation that was refreshing without being cold. You walked toward the center of the chamber and then stopped, turning slowly to absorb the full circle of the space. At the far end, opposite the entrance, stood a row of thick wooden posts set deeply into the sand, their bases weighted with stone blocks to keep them steady. These were the training pali, the silent opponents that had taken the strikes of countless swords and would take yours again this morning. Their wood was pale and scarred, the grain raised in places where repeated impacts had frayed the surface, and they stood in a patient line like sentinels awaiting a watch that never ended. Nearby, a heavy sandbag hung from a ceiling beam by a thick rope, its shape bulging at the bottom where the sand had settled over time, and it turned slightly in a draft so faint you could not feel it on your skin. Against the left wall, a long wooden rack held practice swords of various weights, their wooden blades smooth and dark from the oil of many hands, and beside them rested a stack of woven wicker shields, their edges frayed but their surfaces whole. A stone bench sat against the right wall, long enough for a man to lie upon, with a clay water jug resting on one end and a folded cloth beside it. Everything was in its place, as it always was, arranged with the quiet orderliness of a world where every object had a purpose, and every purpose was honored. The sense of shelter here was profound, a feeling of being entirely enclosed and protected from the vast, exposed world above. The weight of the arena overhead, which could have felt oppressive, instead felt protective, a stone sky that would never fall, a permanent roof that sealed away the noise and glare of the coming day. You breathed out slowly, and the sound of your exhale was clear in the quiet air before it was absorbed by the sand and the stone. You removed your sandals, unbuckling the straps with the same careful movements you had used to put them on, and set them side by side on the stone bench, the leather still warm from your feet. The bare soles of your feet met the sand directly, and the sensation was immediately more intimate, the cool grit pressing up against your arches and sifting gently between your toes. You flexed your feet once, twice, feeling the sand shift in response, and then you stood still again, letting your body settle into the space as water settles into a vessel. The lamplight flickered very slightly as the oil in the nearest lamp reached a small imperfection in the wick, and the brief dip in brightness was like a slow blink from the room itself, a gentle acknowledgement of your presence. All around you, the quiet continued undisturbed by any external sound, and you knew that you had arrived at the heart of the morning, the place where the rest of the world would not find you for hours yet. You were here, and here you would remain, moving through the slow, familiar rituals of practice, while the arena above waited in its own vast silence for the sun to climb the sky. You stood in the center of the sand for a while longer, letting the stillness of the chamber settle around you like a second skin. The lamplight held steady, each flame a small upright teardrop of gold that painted the nearest surfaces with a warm, wavering glow and left the further reaches in a soft brown darkness. The sand beneath your bare feet had already begun to warm slightly from the contact, the grains shifting to accommodate the shape of your soles until they formed a shallow, perfect mold. You could feel the fine texture of the sand as a gentle abrasion, a reminder that you were standing on ground that had been carried here from some distant riverbank or seashore many years ago, each grain a tiny fragment of a larger world. The air was cool on your shoulders and arms, carrying that same complex scent of old stone, lamp oil, and the dry, mineral breath of the sand itself, and you breathed it in slowly, feeling it fill your lungs with the familiar atmosphere of the practice chamber. There was no hurry. The morning outside was only beginning to think about brightening, and you had all the time you needed to cross to the equipment rack and begin the slow, methodical process of preparing for the drills. When you were ready, your feet carried you toward the left wall, where the long wooden rack stood, its legs planted firmly in the sand, and its crossbeams notched to hold the practice swords in neat, separated slots. The rack was made of dark, heavy timber that had been smoothed by countless hands, its surface worn to a dull sheen in the places where fingers habitually gripped, and the scent of old wood and linseed oil drifted from it as you approached. You paused before the rack, and let your eyes travel along the row of practice swords, each one slightly different in weight and balance, their wooden blades ranging from pale ash to deep brown oak. They rested horizontally on their supports, their hilts extending outward, and you could see the way the grain of each blade caught the lamplight in subtle patterns that flowed like still water. The sword you always chose was the third from the left, a heavy length of oak that had been shaped to approximate the weight and feel of a true gladius, its grip wrapped in a simple strip of leather that had darkened over time with the oil of your palm. You reached out and closed your fingers around the grip, feeling the familiar indentation where your hand had held it so many times that the leather had compressed into a custom shape, a hollow that fit your palm and fingers with the precision of a mold. You lifted the sword from the rack, and the weight of it pulled gently at your arm, a solid heft that was satisfying without being straining. The blade was smooth and cool, the oak polished to a dull gleam that reflected the lamplight as a long, narrow stripe of gold along its length. You turned it in your hands, inspecting it as you always did, though you knew there would be no damage to find because the swords were well maintained and you had left it in perfect condition the previous day. The edges were rounded and blunt, incapable of cutting, but the tip had been slightly flattened to prevent splintering, and you ran your thumb over it, feeling the smooth, compact surface. The grip leather was warm where you held it, and you could smell its faint animal scent, a whisper of the tannery that had never entirely faded. You shifted the sword to your left hand and picked up a clean cloth that rested on a shelf below the rack, a square of undyed linen that was soft and slightly frayed at the edges, and you began to wipe the blade with slow, methodical strokes. The cloth slid over the wood with a soft hush, removing the fine layer of dust that had settled overnight, and you worked from the hilt to the tip, rotating the blade to cover every surface. The motion was repetitive and calming, and you let your mind drift as you did it, focusing only on the feel of the cloth and the gradual brightening of the wood as the dust was lifted away. When you were satisfied, you folded the cloth and returned it to the shelf, then hefted the sword in your right hand once more, testing its balance by letting it rest across your palm just behind the guard. The blade tipped neither forward nor backward, remaining perfectly level, and you nodded slightly to yourself before lowering it to your side. Beside the sword rack, a second, wider rack held the practice shields, their woven wicker faces turned outward so that the concentric rings of willow could be seen. The shields were rectangular and slightly curved, their edges bound with rawhide that had dried to a hard brown shell, and each one had a simple leather strap system on the back for the forearm and hand. You selected the shield you always used, the one with a small patch of darker wicker near the upper left corner where a previous repair had been made, and lifted it from its pegs. The shield was lighter than it looked, the wicker construction making it easy to maneuver, but it still had a satisfying substance that spoke of protection and solidity. You rested it against your leg and inspected the front, running your fingers over the woven surface, feeling the slight ridges and valleys where the willow strands crossed one another. The wicker was dry and slightly rough, and a few tiny splinters had lifted over time, but the overall surface was sound. You turned it around and slid your left forearm through the upper strap, then gripped the handhold near the center, a smooth wooden dowel that fit comfortably into your palm. The straps needed tightening, as they always did after a night of rest, and you plucked at the lasses with your free hand, drawing each one snug until the shield sat firmly against your arm without pinching. The process took time, and you gave it all the time it needed, ensuring that the buckle lay flat and the loose ends were tucked away so they would not catch on anything during practice. When the shield was properly fitted, you flexed your arm a few times, watching the way the wicker surface moved with you, and then nodded again, satisfied. You now held the sword in your right hand and the shield on your left arm, and you walked slowly away from the equipment rack to the center of the chamber, feeling the sand give way under each step. The weight of the gear was a familiar presence, a distribution of mass that changed your posture slightly, settling your shoulders into a wider stance and aligning your spine in a particular way. You stood still and closed your eyes for a moment, letting your body remember the feel of the equipment, the way the sword hilt pressed into your palm and the shield strap hugged your forearm. The lamplight on your eyelids was a soft orange glow, and you could hear the tiny hiss of the nearest lamp, a sound as constant as the sea in a shell. You focused on your breathing, drawing it in through your nose and releasing it through your mouth in a slow, measured rhythm. and with each exhale, you felt your muscles loosen slightly, shedding the last remnants of tension from the war. The sword felt as though it belonged in your hand, an extension of your arm rather than a separate object, and the shield had become a part of your body's outer boundary, a portable wall that moved with your will. When you opened your eyes, the chamber was exactly as it had been. The lamps burning steadily, the shadows motionless, the training posts waiting in their patient row at the far end. You decided to check the posts before beginning the drills, and you walked across the sand toward them, your footsteps making a soft crunching sound that echoed gently in the large space. The training pali were 5 in number, each one a thick wooden pole about as tall as a man, set into a heavy stone base that kept them vertical. Their surfaces were deeply scarred, covered with the marks of thousands of practice strikes, shallow dents where sword tips had landed, long scrapes from glancing blows, and darker patches where oil from the practice blades had transferred and soaked into the wood. You stopped before the center post, the one you usually worked with, and placed your palm against its side. The wood was cool and solid, its grain rough under your touch, and you could feel the history of the palace as a kind of stored energy, the memory of every impact it had absorbed. You pushed against it gently, testing its stability, and it did not move, the stone base holding it firmly in the sand. The base itself was a large block of tufa, its edges chipped and its surface covered with a fine dusting of sand, and you nudged it with your toe to make sure it had not shifted since the previous day. Satisfied that the post was ready, you moved on to the neighboring ones, giving each a brief touch and a visual inspection, noting the way the shadows fell across their scarred bodies and the pattern of the lamp glow on their rounded tops. The posts were as much a part of your morning as the sword and shield, silent partners in the long, repetitive work of training, and greeting them in this small way was a ritual that helped you settle into the mindset of practice. Beyond a line of parley, the heavy sandbag hung from its beam, its rope twisting slowly in the almost imperceptible air current. You walked over to it and watched its slow rotation, the way the burlap surface creased and folded as it turned, the stitching along its bottom seam stretched tight by the weight of the sand within. The bag was as tall as your chest and as wide as your shoulders, and it presented a different kind of target, one that swung and gave way when struck, building a different set of muscles than the fixed wooden post. You reached out and stopped its rotation with your palm, feeling the dense packed sand inside shift slightly under the pressure, a sluggish movement that was more a yielding than a displacement. The burlap was rough and smelled of the earth, a dry, dusty scent that reminded you of a sack of grain, and you ran your hand over it, feeling the coarse weave in the places where it had been patched with heavier thread. You pushed the bag gently, setting it swinging in a short, slow arc, and then stepped back to watch it for a few moments. The rope creaked softly where it passed through the iron ring in the ceiling beam, a tiny sound that repeated with each swing: creak, pause, creak, pause, creak, pause, like a lullaby sung by the wood itself. When the bag had nearly come to rest again, you stopped it once more, holding it steady, and then turned away to walk back toward the center of the chamber. The stone bench against the right wall still held your sandals, placed neatly side by side, and the clay water jug with the folded cloth. You went to the bench and sat down for a brief rest, setting the practice sword across your knees and removing the shield from your arm so you could lean it against the bench's side. The stone was cool through your tunic, a pleasant sensation that contrasted with the slight warmth you had generated by moving around, and you rested your hands on your thighs, palms down, feeling the coarse wool under your fingers. The water jug was an unassuming object, its clay body shaped by a potter's wheel with a slightly irregular rim, and its surface was decorated only by a simple band of incised lines near the shoulder. A wooden stopper sealed its mouth, and you reached over and pulled it free with a soft pop, then lifted the jug and poured a small amount of water into the cup that sat beside it. The cup was a simple beaker of red gloss pottery, its interior dark and its exterior smooth, and you held it in both hands, warming the cool clay. You drank slowly as you had in the ludus, letting each sip wash over your tongue and down your throat, the water tasting faintly of the clay and of the cool underground air. It was the same water that traveled from the distant hills through the aqueducts, and you thought for a moment of its long journey, the many miles of stone channels and settling tanks that carried it to the city, and now to this small cup in this hidden chamber. The thought was a quiet one, a passing ripple on the surface of your mind, and it faded as you swallowed the last of the water and set the cup back on the bench. Beside the water jug, the folded cloth invited your attention. It was a larger cloth than the one you had used to wipe the sword, a square of thick linen with hemmed edges, and you picked it up and shook it out, feeling its substantial weight. This was the cloth you used to wipe down your face and arms during practice, and you draped it over your shoulder now, where it would be easy to reach. The linen was clean and smelled of the lavender that the laundry used to keep away moths, a faint, pleasant fragrance that rose gently each time you moved. You stood up from the bench, the cloth settling against your shoulder blade, and retrieved your sword and shield. The sword grip was cool again, where you had not been holding it, and you wrapped your fingers around it once more, feeling the leather warm quickly to your touch. You slid your left arm through the shield strap and tightened the buckle again, a small adjustment that had become necessary after removing it, and then you were ready. The chamber lay before you, its sand raked smooth except where your own footprints marked the surface, and the lamps cast their steady golden light on everything. The training palace stood waiting, the sandbag hung motionless, and the thick wooden floorboards of the arena ceiling sealed the space in its perpetual twilight. You took a deep breath, feeling the air fill you, and then released it slowly, letting your awareness settle entirely into the present moment. The ritual of preparation was complete, and the quiet, repetitive work of the drills could now begin, as it had every morning, as it would for many mornings to come. You moved to the open patch of sand that lay between the equipment rack and the row of wooden training posts, a space you knew as well as the shape of your own hands. This area had been leveled and raked smooth the previous evening, and now only your own footprints disturbed its even surface, a trail of shallow impressions leading from the bench to where you stood. The lamplight reached this spot with a gentle, even glow, the nearest flame burning in a niche about 10 strides to your left, and the light it cast was steady enough to see every small detail of the sand, the way the grains sparkled faintly where tiny crystals of quartz caught the glow, the fine ripples left by the rake that now radiated outward in concentric arcs, the slightly darker patches where the sand was a little more compact. You took a moment to appreciate the blank canvas of the ground before you, and then you set your feet into position, the beginning stance that was the foundation of every other movement. Your left foot slid forward until it was roughly a shoulder's width ahead of your right, its outer edge aligned with the imaginary line that ran straight ahead toward the training posts. The right foot turned outward slightly, the heel lifted just enough to give your back leg a spring-like readiness, and you settled your weight evenly between the two, feeling the sand compress beneath your soles as your body found its balance. The knees softened, bending just a little so that your thighs took up the burden of holding you and your hips tucked forward, straightening the lower spine into a neutral line that felt both strong and relaxed. Your left arm, bearing the shield, came forward until the wicker surface covered your torso, from shoulder to mid-thigh, its slight curve facing the empty space ahead, while your right hand held the practice sword at hip level, the wooden blade pointing not quite upward, but angled slightly forward, a guard position that left room to thrust or cut without telegraphing intent. The cloth over your shoulder shifted gently with the movement, and then settled, its weight a soft reminder against your back. You stood there, motionless, and let the stance become a form of meditation, a deliberate arrangement of the body that required no thought once achieved, but which could be refined endlessly with the smallest adjustments. The first part of the drill was the simplest, and you entered it without hurry, allowing the shift to happen almost on its own. Your weight began to move. A slow transfer from the center into the ball of your left foot, then back to the right. A gentle rocking that barely lifted your heels and did not move your feet from their positions. The motion was so small that an observer might have missed it, but you felt every subtle change, the slight increase of pressure under the left arch, the corresponding release under the right heel, the way the sand gave just a fraction more beneath the weighted foot. You repeated this transfer many times, building a rhythm that was less a count and more a feeling, like the slow back and forth of a pendulum that had been set swinging in deep water. The sway became automatic, and as you continued, your breathing naturally aligned with the motion, an inhale as the weight shifted forward, an exhale as it returned. Though you did not force this coupling, it simply happened, the way lungs and heart settle into synchrony during rest. The sound of the sand under your feet was a soft, continuous whisper, a hush-hush that blended into the background hum of the lamps and the deep, pervasive silence of the stone chamber. You let this gentle oscillation go on for a long time, watching nothing, thinking nothing, feeling only the steady pendular shift of your own mass. After a while, the sway deepened into a larger pattern. As you began to take small, deliberate steps forward and back, you would slide your left foot ahead a handspan, the sand scraping softly, and then draw your right foot after it to resume the stance, repeating this advance 3 or 4 times in a row until your leading foot neared the base of the nearest training post. Then, just as smoothly, you reversed the sequence, pushing off the front foot and stepping back, each retreat bringing you toward your starting point. The movement was unhurried and continuous, each step taken with the same careful precision as the one before, the shield remaining steady on your arm, the sword point holding its forward angle without wavering. You focused on keeping your head level, not bobbing up and down, which required a subtle engagement of the core muscles and a looseness in the hips that allowed the legs to glide beneath you. The sand, which had been smooth only minutes before, now showed a long trail of footprints leading toward the palace and back again, their shapes distinct and orderly, like the marks of a single large creature that had walked this way many times. The forward steps were met with the same receptive silence from the training post, its scarred wood looking on without judgment, and the backward steps carried you into the open part of the chamber, where the lamp glow was a little dimmer and the air a shade cooler on your neck. When you had completed enough direct advances and retreats, you varied the pattern by turning the forward step into a lunge, extending your right arm so that the sword point tapped the exact center of the palace with a soft, hollow thud. Then drawing back immediately into the guard position, you repeated the lunge many times, the motion becoming a single smooth phrase: forward knee bends, arm extends, wood meets wood, and then the recoil that brought you back to center. The strike was not forceful. You were not trying to break the post, but simply to touch it, to build the muscle memory of distance and timing. The thud of the impact was a punctuation in the quiet, a brief note that died as quickly as it was born, and the next lunge would produce the same sound, identical in pitch and duration, until the repetition folded into a kind of silence of its own. Your breathing deepened further, not from exertion, but from the sustained, rhythmic motion, and you could feel a pleasant warmth beginning to spread through the large muscles of your legs, a gentle heat that softened the fibers and made each step feel slightly more fluid than the last. Between sets of forward drills, you paused for a moment in the starting stance, letting your arms drop just a little so that the sword point rested on the sand and the shield hung at your side. You lifted the cloth from your shoulder and wiped your brow with a slow, circular motion, the linen cool against your skin, absorbing the faint moisture that had gathered there. The air flowed over your now damp forehead with a soft coolness, and you closed your eyes briefly, savoring the feeling. When you opened them again, nothing in the chamber had altered. The lamps burned on, the shadows held their shapes, the training posts waited. You returned the cloth to your shoulder, lifted the sword back to hip level, and drew the shield up across your body. Then you shifted your stance and began the lateral movement drills. For the lateral work, you turned your body so that your lead foot pointed not straight ahead, but along an imaginary line running parallel to the row of palli, and you began to step sideward, first to the right, leading with the heel of your right foot and following with the left, keeping your shoulders squared forward toward the imaginary opponent. The motion was a graceful gliding, a crab-like progression that ate up the sand in measured hand spans, and you moved 5 strides to the right, then reversed and moved 5 strides to the left, returning to your original position. The sand crunched more softly under these sideward steps, a sound that was more a brushing than a grinding, and the shield remained forward throughout, its wicker surface never dipping. You noticed how the lateral movement required the use of different muscles in the hips, small stabilizers that woke up and began to work, and you paid attention to the way your feet had to lift just a little higher to clear the sand without dragging, a small adjustment that your body learned and then forgot as it became automatic. The sideward path traced a short, neat rectangle in the sand, its outline crisp and clean, and you walked it again and again until the rectangle became a groove, the sand packed down by your repeated passage. Once the sideways movement felt as natural as the forward and backward, you combined them into a box pattern, 4 steps forward, 4 steps to the right, 4 steps back, 4 steps back, 4 steps to the left, returning always to the center. The box was a simple figure, but it held your attention completely, each step requiring a slight pivot of the hips and a reorientation of the shield arm that had to be executed without breaking the flow. The sequence turned into a slow, silent dance, its rhythm marked by the soft scuff of your feet and the steady hiss of the lamps, and you circled the box many times, each circuit taking perhaps a count of 40 breaths. By the 3rd or 4th circuit, your body had memorized the pattern so completely that your conscious mind could step aside and simply observe, watching the legs carry you through the familiar geometry as though they belonged to someone else. This floating sensation was a familiar one, a sign that the drill had moved beyond practice into something more like trance, and you welcomed it as an old companion. The box in the sand became a path worn smooth, a small territory that you had claimed and defended with nothing more than your presence. You broke the box pattern by shifting into a wide circular walk, using the center of the chamber as a hub. You began to step around an imaginary circle about the diameter of a small fountain, your body facing outward toward the ring, the shield always pointing away from the center. The footsteps traced a smooth arc, and you moved clockwise for a long series of steps, the sand compressing into a continuous curved track. The circular path brought you closer to the walls at some points, and nearer the training posts at others, and the lamplight played over your moving form, casting a shadow that stretched and shrank as you passed each niche. You watched the shadow sometimes, a dark companion that mimicked your every move on the pale sand, and other times you looked ahead into the dimness, letting your eyes rest on nothing in particular. The circle was hypnotic in its endlessness, each step leading necessarily to the next, the arc never straightening, the destination never arriving. You could walk this circle forever, you felt, and the chamber would hold you in its quiet embrace, the lamps never guttering, the sand never running out. After many circuits clockwise, you paused long enough to turn in place, reversing your stance so that you faced the opposite direction, and then resumed the walk counterclockwise. The change felt subtly different. The leading foot was now the left, the shield was on the outside of the circle, and the whole arrangement of your body had to adapt. The adjustment was small and interesting, a mental note rather than a difficulty, and you continued the counterclockwise rounds with the same steady patience. The circle path now intersected your earlier footprints, creating a complex pattern in the sand that was beautiful in its randomness, the record of a solitary walker who had filled the chamber with a silent map of his own making. The only constant was the soft, rhythmic sound of your footfalls, a hush in the sand that had become the heartbeat of the morning. Eventually, you returned to the center of the chamber, the point from which you had started the drills, and stood still in the beginning stance. The sand around you was thoroughly marked with your footprints, a palimpsest of paths and patterns that would be raked smooth again at the end of the day. The warmth in your legs had grown into a gentle, pervasive heat that reached up into your lower back and down into your calves, and your breathing, though still steady, had taken on a deeper quality, each inhale filling the bottom of your lungs, each exhale emptying them completely. Your arms felt loose and strong, the sword and shield as light now as they would ever feel, and your mind had become a quiet pool, undisturbed by any ripple of thought beyond the immediate awareness of your body in the space. You stood there for a long time, not as a pause between exercises, but as a continuation of the practice in stillness. The stance itself, an active posture that required a low, constant hum of engagement. The feet remained grounded, the knees softly bent, the core alert, and you simply breathed, watching the gentle rise and fall of the shield on your arm, feeling the weight of the sword pulling lightly at your wrist. The lamplight flickered once, a tiny dip in brightness as a lamp somewhere behind you consumed a small impurity in the oil, and then steadied again, and you took this as a signal, a gentle nudge from the chamber itself, to move onward. But first you lowered the sword point to the sand and rolled your shoulders in a slow circle, once forward and once back, feeling the joint settle into a deeper ease, and then you lifted the blade again, ready for whatever the next quiet drill would bring. The training post stood before you, a patient column of pale wood rising from its stone base, and you approached it with the same quiet step you had used to circle the chamber. The sand near the palers was packed firmer than elsewhere, compressed by days and months of footfalls, until it formed a shallow depression that cupped your bare feet like a worn threshold. You stopped within arm's reach of the post, close enough that the tip of your practice sword could touch the wood without your needing to lean forward, and you let your eyes trace the surface of the palus once more. The scars on the timber were a language of their own, each dent a syllable, each long scrape a sentence, and together they told the story of countless mornings like this one. Mornings when the arena above lay silent, and the lamps below burned their steady gold. The wood itself was a pale oak, its grain running vertically in fine, straight lines that were interrupted here and there by darker knots, and the surface had been worn smooth in the places that received the most strikes, polished to a subtle sheen that caught the lamplight and returned it as a soft, diffuse glow. You lifted your practice sword and brought its blunt tip to rest lightly against the center of the post, a touch so gentle that it produced no sound, only a faint vibration that traveled through the wood and into your hand, a silent greeting between blade and target. Then you drew the sword back, your arm bending at the elbow until the hilt was level with your ribs, and you began the first drill. The thrust was a simple movement, a straight extension of the arm that sent the sword point forward in a clean, unhurried line. The wooden tip met the post with a low thud, a sound that was more a suggestion of impact than a true noise, and you held the position for a moment, arm fully extended, shield covering your left side, body aligned behind the strike. The point had landed exactly where you intended, a shallow dimple among many such dimples, and you observed it without pride or disappointment, simply noting the accuracy as a fact of the morning. Then you withdrew the blade, bending the elbow once more and returning to the guard position, and you paused for the space of a slow exhale before repeating the motion. The second thrust produced the same soft thud, the sword point finding its home again, and you held it once more before withdrawing. You did this many times, each thrust identical to the one before in speed, force, and trajectory, the blade sliding forward through the lamplit air with a faint whisper that was barely audible beneath the recurring thud of contact. Your breathing fell into time with the repetitions, an exhale accompanying each extension, an inhale during each withdrawal, and this coupling of breath and motion turned the drill into a single long, continuous act, like a wheel turning or a pendulum swinging, each revolution the same as the last. As the thrusts accumulated, you began to notice the subtle feedback the post provided, how a strike that landed with the tip perfectly centered produced a clean, solid thud with no secondary vibration, while a thrust that arrived a hair to one side sent a tiny shudder through the blade that you felt as a brief buzz in your palm. These variations were small and far between, and you corrected them without conscious thought, your arm making micro-adjustments that kept the sword point returning to the same spot. The leather grip of the hilt had grown warm and slightly damp under your fingers, conforming ever more closely to the shape of your hand, and the weight of the sword, which you had been aware of at the start, had now faded into the background of sensation, becoming simply a part of you that moved when you willed it. The shield on your left arm remained steady, its wicker surface tilted just enough to deflect an imaginary blow from the side, and you held it without tension, the strap snug around your forearm and the hand grip resting lightly in your palm. The cloth over your shoulder brushed against your back with each thrust, a soft reminder of the linen's presence, and the sand underfoot shifted minutely each time your stance adjusted to accommodate the extension of your arm. After a long sequence of thrusts, you allowed your arm to fall to your side, the sword point resting in the sand, and you stood still, breathing deeply and evenly. The warmth in your right shoulder was more pronounced now, a gentle heat that spread down into the upper arm and across the shoulder blade, the result of the repeated extension and the weight of the wooden blade. You rolled the shoulder in a slow circle, feeling the joint move freely, and then lifted the sword again. This time, instead of thrusting, you raised the blade a little higher and brought it down in a simple cut, a diagonal arc that began above your right shoulder and ended with the flat of the blade tapping the post at about waist height. The tap was lighter than the thrusts had been, a sharper but softer sound, and the wood grain showed a faint streak where the edge, rounded though it was, had made contact. You repeated the cut many times, the blade rising and falling in a steady rhythm, the lamplight sliding along its length with each motion. The cut required a slight rotation of the wrist and a gentle engagement of the forearm muscles, different from the thrust's straightforward drive, and you paid attention to the way these muscles woke up and began to work, a sensation that was pleasant in its novelty after the long sequence of extensions. After many cuts, you combined the two, alternating thrusts and cuts in a simple pattern that you let evolve naturally. First, you performed 3 measured thrusts, each one landing with that familiar low thud, and then you followed with a single diagonal cut, the blade sweeping down and tapping the post at a slightly different angle. You repeated this sequence many times, the rhythm becoming a 4-count phrase that your body learned, and then forgot as it became automatic. The pattern shifted, and you began performing 2 cuts, one from the right and one from the left, pausing between them to reset, and then returning to the thrusts. The post received each strike without complaint, its scarred surface absorbing the impacts and returning only the soft, muted sounds that had become the music of the morning. The lamp nearest the palace flickered once, a quick dimming that you caught in your peripheral vision, and then it steadied, the flame burning bright again, and you continued the alternation without breaking stride. The drill deepened as you introduced the shield into the sequence, using it to block an imaginary counterstrike before delivering your own. You would thrust the sword forward, withdraw, then immediately raise the shield as though catching a blow from above, the wicker surface tilting upward and taking the imagined impact with a slight flex of your arm, and then you would follow with a cut, the blade arcing around the shield's edge to tap the post. The combination required a coordination of both arms that felt like a quiet conversation between your 2 sides, the left speaking with the shield and the right answering with the sword, and you repeated the sequence until the conversation became a single flowing sentence. The shield's movement produced a faint rustle, the wicker strands shifting against one another, and this sound joined the thud of the sword and the soft crunch of the sand to form a small, contained world of noise that seemed to exist only within the radius of the palace. Outside that radius, the chamber was silent and still, the lamps burning on, the shadows unmoving, the ceiling beams hanging in their dark repose. Now you began to vary the target on the post, aiming some thrusts higher, toward a spot roughly level with where an opponent's chest would be, and some lower, toward the midsection, while the cuts swept across at different heights, sometimes at shoulder level and sometimes lower, mimicking the arc of a true gladius seeking different openings. The post was wide enough to offer several distinct zones, each marked by its own pattern of scars, and you moved the sword point from one to another without pattern, letting your arm choose the spot based on the feel of the previous strike. If a thrust landed a little high, the next would seek a lower target. If a cut came in slightly steep, the next would be shallower, the blade traveling a longer, flatter arc. These adjustments were not conscious decisions, but rather the natural feedback between hand, eye, and wood, a closed loop that refined itself with each repetition. The sweat that had begun to gather on your brow earlier now formed a thin, even sheen across your forehead, and a single drop traced a cool path down your temple before being absorbed by the cloth that rested on your shoulder. Your breathing had deepened further, each inhale drawing the cool underground air deep into the lungs, each exhale leaving in a slow, warm stream that you could feel against your upper lip. The breathing was a part of the rhythm now, as much a component of the drill as the movement of the sword, and it never quickened or became strained. It simply grew deeper, more expansive, filling you with the quiet energy of sustained, unhurried effort. You paused long enough to lift the cloth from your shoulder and wipe your face, passing the linen over your forehead, your cheeks, and the back of your neck, where the skin was warm and slightly damp. The cloth was cool and dry in patches, and you turned it to find those patches, pressing them against your skin until the moisture had been lifted away. Then you draped the cloth back over your shoulder and picked up the sword once more, noticing that the grip now felt even more natural, the leather having absorbed a little moisture from your palm and become slightly tacky, which improved the hold. You adjusted your stance, settling the shield more firmly on your arm, and then approached the post from a slightly different angle, standing not directly in front of it but a step to the left, so that your shield side was closer to the wood. From this position, you practiced thrusts that wrapped around the post's imaginary guard, the sword point traveling a curved path that ended with a light tap on the side of the palace. The movement required a subtle twist of the wrist at the end of the extension, a small flare that you practiced many times until it became smooth and natural, the tip arriving at the same spot each time with the same soft thud. The sound from this angle was slightly different, the wood resonating with a higher pitch because the strike landed on the side rather than the dense center, and you noted the difference without dwelling on it, simply adding it to the quiet tapestry of the drill. The shield was not idle during these angled thrusts. After each strike, you drew it back and then forward again, simulating the parry of a counter-thrust from the imaginary opponent that the post represented. The wicker surface came up, angled outward, and you imagined the wooden blade of an adversary sliding off its curved face, deflected harmlessly to the side, creating an opening that your own sword then exploited. The sequence flowed: thrust, withdraw, parry with the shield, step in, thrust again, a cycle that turned at a pace as slow and steady as a water wheel. The sand underfoot absorbed the slight shifts of your weight, and the footprints around the post multiplied until they formed a dense, overlapping record of your presence, a palimpsest of souls that would vanish when the rate passed over them at day's end. The post, for its part, took every strike with the same stoic patience, its wood vibrating briefly after each hit and then falling still, only to be struck again. The cycle between strikes was long enough that the vibrations always died completely, the post returning to perfect rest before the next impact, and this gap of stillness became a part of the rhythm, a pause that held the drill together, like the silence between notes in a slow melody. You continued until the sequence had been repeated so many times that the count was lost, the numbers dissolving into the pure sensation of the motion, and then you stepped back from the post and let the sword hang at your side. The warmth in your body was now a full, glowing presence, radiating from your shoulders down through your arms and from your hips down through your legs, a deep heat that was entirely comfortable, a sign of muscles well used but not exhausted. You stood in the quiet and let your breathing slow, each breath now a long, luxurious pull of the cool air, each exhale a soft release that misted faintly in the lamplight before vanishing. The shield felt heavier now, a comfortable weight that anchored your left side, and you shifted it slightly to ease the strap's pressure on your forearm before settling it back into place. The post before you seemed unchanged, its scars no deeper than before, its wood still solid and silent, and yet you felt a quiet satisfaction in the work done, a sense of completion that was as undemanding as everything else in this underground hour. After a rest that might have lasted a minute or 10, you returned to the post for one final series. This time you closed your eyes and relied on touch alone, letting your body remember the distance and the angle without the aid of sight. You raised the sword, felt the weight, and extended your arm in a slow, careful thrust that ended when the wooden tip met the post with its familiar low thud. Without opening your eyes, you withdrew and repeated, the darkness behind your eyelids merging with the dimness of the chamber to create a uniform field of warm black. The sound of the strike was now your only guide, and you listened to it closely, noting how it changed subtly if the tip landed a fraction to the left or right, and you corrected each slight deviation on the following thrust. The post became a presence that you felt through the sword, an anchor point in the darkness that was always there, always solid, always waiting. You executed a series of slow cuts, eyes still closed, feeling the arc of the blade through the air by the resistance it met, the slight drag of the atmosphere against the flat of the wood, and then the soft tap of contact. The shield came up in a parry, guided by memory, and you heard the rustle of the wicker close to your ear, a sound that was intimate and reassuring. The entire series was performed in this blind state, a slow dance in the dark that ended when you opened your eyes again to the same steady lamplight and the same patient post, which had not moved, which had not changed, which stood exactly where it always had and always would. You took one more step back, lowering the sword until its tip rested on the sand, and you placed your free hand against the post, feeling the warmth that your strikes had imparted to the wood. It was a faint warmth, barely above the ambient coolness, but it was there, a tiny record of the energy you had spent. You let your palm rest there for a while, absorbing the texture of the scarred grain, and then you patted the post once. A soft, soundless gesture that was less a farewell than an acknowledgement. The post had done its work, and you had done yours, and the morning was still young, the arena above still silent, the lamps still burning with their endless patient flames. You turned away from the palace and walked slowly back toward the center of the chamber, where the sand was a little looser and the lamplight a little brighter. And you stood there, sword in hand, shield on arm, breathing the cool underground air, ready to continue the quiet, repetitive work that filled these hours before sunrise. You left the training post behind, its familiar scarred surface receding into the shadows as you walked back toward the center of the practice chamber. The sand, now thoroughly marked with the record of your earlier drills, accepted your returning footsteps with the same soft yielding it had offered all morning, each step producing a quiet crunch that was immediately absorbed by the vast, still air. The lamplight here was a little brighter, several niches converging their warm glow into a pool of steady gold that illuminated an open circle of sand roughly 10 strides across, and it was to this circle that you gravitated, knowing it was the ideal space for the work that came next. You stopped at its center and turned to face the empty air, the sword resting easily in your right hand, with its blunt tip angled downward, the shield held across your body in a relaxed but ready position. The cloth over your shoulder had shifted during the walk, and you reached up to adjust it, smoothing the linen flat, so it would not bunch under your arm, and then you let your hand fall back to the sword grip, settling into the beginning stance with the same automatic ease you had practiced earlier. Before you, there was nothing but the open chamber, the far wall just visible as a dim plane of rough stone, the lamps burning evenly in their niches. Yet in your mind a presence was already forming, a silent partner conjured from years of experience, an opponent who would never tire, never strike too hard, never do anything except exactly what you imagined him to do. This imaginary opponent took shape gradually, defined not by a face or a name but by a set of possibilities. He was of similar height and reach, armed with the same wooden sword and wicker shield, and he stood now perhaps 2 arm lengths away, mirroring your stance. You did not picture him visually so much as feel his weight in the space, a pressure against your awareness that gave purpose to the empty sand. The first movement was his, an imagined thrust aimed at your midsection, and you responded by raising your shield just enough to deflect the invisible blade, the wicker surface tilting outward with a soft rustle as your arm absorbed the phantom impact. The motion was gentle, almost lazy, yet precise. The shield angled at the correct slant to send the imaginary point sliding harmlessly past your left hip. As you parried, your right foot slid backward a few inches, creating distance, and you felt your shadow shift on the sand, a dark shape that stretched toward the nearest lamp as though reaching for its light. You held the parry for a slow count, then stepped forward again, closing the gap while bringing your own sword up into a low thrust that would have found his thigh had he been real. The blade traveled through the air with a faint, clean whisper, slowing to a stop at the exact extension you intended, and then you withdrew it, returning to guard. The exchange repeated, with variations as you began to cycle through a loop of movements that formed the core of this shadow sparring. Your opponent would attack, and you would respond, then counter, then retreat, then advance again, the sequence flowing without pause or urgency. The footwork was the foundation, and you let it guide everything else. A step back to avoid a cut, the sand slipping under your heel, then a swift forward step that carried you inside his imagined guard, your shield pushing his shield aside while your sword tapped the empty air where his chest would be. The transitions between high guard and low guard were smooth, your sword arm rising and falling like a slow wing, the blade gleaming dully as it caught the lamplight at different angles. When you shifted into a defensive posture, you crouched slightly behind the shield, peering over its curved top, and when you attacked, you opened your stance, extending the sword in a line that felt natural and true. The shadow on the wall behind you mimicked every pose, a dark twin that stretched and compressed with each step, now tall and narrow as you raised the sword overhead, now squat and wide as you dropped into a low block. You caught glimpses of it from time to time, a silent companion performing the same dance, its edges blurring slightly where the lamplight faltered. There was no sound of weapon striking weapon, no clash of wood on wood to punctuate the sequence, only the soft, repetitive whisper of your bare soles in the sand, and the near-silent displacement of air as the practice sword carved its arcs. The quiet was so complete that you could hear the faint rustle of the wicker shield each time you moved it, the strands shifting against one another like dry grass in a breeze, and the even fainter sound of your tunic brushing against your skin. Your breathing remained deep and even, an unhurried tide that flowed in and out without reference to the imagined combat, because there was no real exertion, only the steady, meditative motion of limbs that knew their task. The imaginary opponent never rushed you. His attacks came at the pace you chose, allowing you to dwell in each parry, each riposte, each careful retreat. You might spend a dozen slow breaths simply circling, your feet crossing over one another as you traced a wide arc around the edge of the lit sand, your shield always facing the imagined threat, your sword held ready, and the opponent would circle with you, maintaining the distance, waiting for you to decide the next engagement. The circling itself became a form of meditation, your feet moving in a smooth lateral glide that ate up the sand in patient increments. You noted the subtle difference between circling clockwise and counterclockwise, the way your lead leg changed, the slight variation in how you held the shield when it was on the inside or outside of the turn, and you let these small discoveries guide the rhythm. Halfway around the circle, you paused and changed direction, stepping back to create a wider gap, before closing in again with a series of small, rapid advances that ended in a flurry of 3 imagined strikes, a cut to the head, a thrust to the body, and a low sweep toward the legs, each one executed with the same deliberate slowness you had used on the Palus. The sword moved through the sequence without haste, and you watched its tip trace the path, ensuring it traveled through the exact points in the air that would have made contact. Then you retreated, shuffling backward with your shield raised, and the cycle began anew. The shadow played a quiet game of its own on the rough stone wall. It elongated dramatically when you advanced toward the lamp, the sword becoming a thin dark line that stretched far beyond your actual reach, and it compressed into a squat, dense shape when you drew near the wall itself, the shield swelling to a broad oval that enveloped your torso. Between these extremes, it flowed through 1,000 transitional forms, a fluid silhouette that you observed without fixation, simply allowing its presence to be part of the experience. The wall's uneven surface broke the shadow into softer edges, the pits and ridges of the stone catching the lamplight differently and creating a fringe of ambiguity at the borders of the dark shape. Sometimes the shadow seemed to move independently, lagging a fraction behind your actual motion due to the placement of the lamps, and this small discrepancy gave the exercise a dreamlike quality, as though you and your shadow were 2 separate beings engaged in the same slow ritual. You shifted the focus of the shadow sparring to the shield arm, practicing a series of parries against imagined attacks coming from different angles. First, you lifted the shield high to catch a descending cut, tilting it so that the blow would slide off the curved wicker surface and leave the opponent's side open, and then you thrust your sword into that opening, the blade extending smoothly. Next, you dropped the shield low to block a thrust aimed at your legs, the wicker brushing against the sand with a soft hiss, and you followed with a rising cut that swept upward from the block. Then you swept the shield outward to deflect a horizontal slash, turning your body with the motion and stepping laterally to flank the imagined attacker, your sword coming around in a wide arc that ended with a tap on the air. Each variation was explored many times before you moved to the next, the repetitions building a quiet confidence that required no confirmation, only the internal sense of a movement well performed. The sand around you grew increasingly patterned with the traces of these drills, a complex map of arcs, straight lines and pivot points that told a story of the last hour without words. After the shield parries, you inverted the practice by imagining yourself as the aggressor, pressing the attack while the unseen opponent retreated and defended. You stepped forward with a thrust that he would parry, and in your mind you felt the slight jar of wood on wood. So you withdrew the blade and immediately cut from the other side, forcing him to shift his shield. Your feet carried you forward in a steady, unhurried advance, each step planted with care, and the opponent gave ground until you had driven him to the edge of the lit circle, at which point you paused, allowed the imaginary distance to re-establish, and then began again from the center. The forward movement felt different from the retreating drills. Your weight shifted more onto the balls of your feet, and you leaned slightly into the advance. The shield held a little more aggressively, and these small physical adjustments added variety to the long, slow rhythm of the session. The silence absorbed every motion, offering no resistance, no critique, only the boundless patience of the underground chamber. At times you would stop entirely, freezing in the middle of a sequence, and hold a position while you examined it. Perhaps your sword was extended in a thrust, your front knee bent, your shield arm drawn back, and you would remain there, feeling the way the pose engaged certain muscles in your back and hip, noticing a slight tension in your shoulder that could be released, making the adjustment, and then resuming the motion from that point. These pauses were as much a part of the shadow sparring as the movements themselves, for the imaginary opponent waited with perfect patience, suspended in whatever moment you had left him, and the chamber asked nothing of you but to take the time you needed. The lamplight flickered, a tiny dip in brightness as a wick consumed a drop of oil, and you used that flicker as a marker, a gentle signal to shift into a new sequence, perhaps one that focused on footwork without the sword, or sword work without moving the feet. You lowered the sword and shield for a moment, placing them carefully on the sand beside you, and practiced a series of empty hand parries and body shifts, imagining the opponent's blade seeking openings that you closed with a turn of the torso or a duck of the head. Your hands, free of weight, moved through the familiar paths with a lightness that felt almost like floating, and you circled the empty space, practicing the evasive footwork that would keep you just beyond the reach of a real blade. Then you picked up the equipment again, the sword gripped cool for the first few seconds until your palm warmed it, and resumed the full practice. The break had lasted only a few minutes, but it refreshed your awareness of the sword's weight, making the next series of cuts feel deliberate and grounded. The shadow on the wall had shifted its angle as you moved around the chamber, and now it fell across a different stretch of stone, crossing over a vertical seam where two blocks met and bending at that seam, like a figure walking through a door. You followed it with your eyes for a moment, noticing how the seam divided the shadow into two parts that did not quite align, a natural trick of the flickering light, and then you let your attention return to the imaginary opponent, who remained as patient as ever. You advanced one final time, engaging him in a slow exchange that combined everything you had practiced: a high parry, a sidestep, a thrust to the body, a retreat, a circling step, and then a closing sequence of 3 cuts that flowed one into the next like the final phrases of a long piece of music. When the last cut had been delivered, you stepped back and lowered the sword, letting the tip rest on the sand, and the imaginary opponent dissolved back into the silence from which he had come, his work done. The chamber was exactly as it had been, the lamps burning, the shadows still, the ceiling beams massive and dark overhead, the training posts standing in their patient row. But the feeling of the space had shifted subtly, charged now with the quiet energy of the shadow sparring, a sense of having filled the emptiness with purposeful motion. Your body hummed with a low, pleasant warmth that extended from your shoulders to your calves, and your breathing, while still deep and calm, carried a slight additional depth that spoke of sustained, gentle effort. You lifted the cloth from your shoulder and wiped your face again, feeling the cool linen pass over your brow and cheeks, and then you draped it back into place and stood in the center of the lit circle, sword and shield held at rest, your eyes moving slowly over the walls and the sand and the lamps. The deep concentration that had held everything else away during the shadow sparring was now receding, leaving behind a peaceful stillness, a mind as smooth and undisturbed as the surface of a pool of water. You were ready to move on to the conditioning work, but for now you simply stood and breathed, letting the quiet of the underground wrap around you once more. The wooden bench received the practice sword with a soft clatter as you laid it down, the oak blade settling against the worn plank with a finality that marked the end of the weapon drills. You loosened the shield strap and slid your arm free, feeling the cool air touch the skin where the leather had rested, and then you set the wicker shield beside the sword, its curved face turned toward the sand. The equipment looked peaceful there, resting on the bench as though asleep, and you took a moment to rub your left forearm where the strap had left a faint impression, a pink line that would fade within minutes. The cloth on your shoulder was still damp in places, and you pulled it free, shook it out once, and laid it across the bench beside the sword. The chamber around you remained as still as ever, the lamps burning with their small, steady flames, the sand marked everywhere with the evidence of your work. You stood beside the bench, letting your arms hang loose at your sides, and you rolled your shoulders slowly, once forward and once back, enjoying the simple motion of the joints. The warmth in your muscles was a pleasant, diffuse glow, and you knew it was time to move into the slower, deeper work of conditioning, the quiet maintenance of strength that required no weapon but the body itself. You walked a few paces from the bench to an area where the sand was especially soft and loose, having been less disturbed by the earlier drills. Here, you turned to face the length of the chamber, the training posts forming a distant line on your left and the arched entrance on your right, and you planted your feet a little wider than your hips, toes pointing gently outward. The beginning stance for the squat was a simple, grounded posture, and you settled into it without hurry, feeling the sand press up against your soles and the slight give of the earth beneath. You let your arms rest at your sides, hands open, and you took a slow, deep breath that filled the bottom of your lungs and lifted your chest just a fraction. On the exhale, you began to bend your knees, sinking downward at a pace so gradual it felt like settling into warm water, and the motion continued until your thighs were nearly parallel with the sand and your hips had dropped below your knees. The deep squat position was a familiar one, the weight distributed evenly across both feet, the spine long and neutral, the arms hanging forward for balance. You held there, suspended in the squat, and let the feeling spread through the large muscles of your legs, a soft, steady burn that was less a discomfort and more a hum, a low vibration of effort that filled the quadriceps and the glutes. Time stretched as you held the position, your breathing calm and regular, the air cool on the back of your neck, and the only movement was a slight tremor in your thighs, a tiny oscillation that you observed without concern. After a long pause that was measured not in seconds but in the slow rhythm of your breath, you pressed through your heels and rose back to standing with the same deliberate slowness, the legs straightening smoothly until you were upright once more. The release of tension felt like a small, quiet reward, a softening of the muscle fibers that left a pleasant warmth in its wake. You repeated the squat many times, each repetition a single unbroken motion that descended, paused, and ascended without haste or count. The breaths guided you, an inhale at the top, an exhale as you lowered, a gentle hold as you breathed in and out once at the bottom, then another exhale to rise. The pattern was fluid, and you let it vary naturally, sometimes holding at the bottom for 3 slow breaths, sometimes rising after only 1, never forcing the rhythm into a strict meter. Your mind, which had been focused during the saw drills, now drifted into a softer awareness, noting the subtle changes in the body with each squat, the way the warmth spread a little further down the calves after the 5th or 6th repetition, the slight increase in the depth of the squat as the hips loosened, the feeling of the sand shifting under your heels as you pressed upward. The sound of your breathing was the loudest thing in the chamber, a gentle tide that seemed to synchronize with the distant hiss of the lamps, and the silence between breaths was a deep, receptive pool. You continued until the hum in your legs had become a constant, steady presence. And then you paused, standing upright, letting the arms dangle, and you walked a slow, small circle on the sand to let the muscles settle. The walking was aimless, a meandering path that carried you a few steps toward the training posts and then back toward the bench, your eyes resting on the lamplight as it played over the rough stone pillars that supported the ceiling. The pillars were square and solid, their surfaces marked with the same chisel strokes you had noticed in the passage, and the torchlight, though there were no torches, only oil lamps, painted them in warm amber tones that deepened the shadows in the corners. The damp air cooled the thin sheen of sweat on your skin, and you felt a pleasant chill pass over your arms and forehead, a refreshment that made the next movement inviting. After the circle walk, you returned to your spot in the soft sand and shifted your stance for the lunges. You stood with feet together, hands resting lightly on your hips, and you drew a slow breath before stepping forward with your right leg into a long, deep lunge. The front knee bent until it was directly above the ankle, the back leg extended behind with the heel lifted and the toes pressed into the sand, and you lowered your hips until you felt a deep stretch through the front of the back thigh and the hip flexor. The position was held not with tension, but with a calm, receptive stillness, your body sinking into the stretch as though the weight of the air above was gently pressing you down. You stayed there for several slow breaths, feeling the stretch shift and deepen as the muscle fibers gradually released, the sensation traveling up through the hip and into the lower back. The lamplight flickered softly across your extended arms, and you noticed the shadow of your lunge on the sand, a long angular shape that reminded you of a compass needle pointing toward the far wall. After the hold, you pushed off the front foot and stepped back to the starting position. the back leg returning beneath you with a soft brush of sand, and you pause to let the blood flow equalize before repeating the lunge with the left leg forward. The left side felt slightly different, the stretch locating itself in a subtly distinct set of fibers, and you held it with the same patience, breathing into the sensation until it softened. You alternated legs in this way, moving from right to left with a slow, measured rhythm, and each lunge deepened the overall feeling of openness in your hips and the long muscles of the thighs. Between sets, you would sometimes pause in a standing forward bend, letting your arms hang loosely toward the sand and your head dangle, the spine releasing in a gentle curve that relieved any tension in the lower back. The inversion brought a mild rush of blood to your head, a pleasant pressure that cleared the mind, and you stayed there until you felt ready to rise and begin the lunges again. When the lunges had done their work, leaving your legs feeling long and loose and warm, you straightened up and walked over to the corner where a small collection of weighted stones rested against the wall. These were simple river stones, smoothed by water over centuries, each roughly the size of a small melon, but heavier than they looked. Their surfaces cool and faintly damp to the touch. You selected one that fit comfortably in your palm, its weight perhaps 10 Roman pounds, and you carried it back to the open sand. Holding the stone in your right hand, you let your arm hang at your side, then lifted it slowly upward in a curl, bending at the elbow and bringing the stone toward your shoulder. The movement was accompanied by an exhale, the breath leaving your lungs in a steady stream as the stone rose, and at the top of the lift you paused, the bicep fully engaged, before lowering the stone with the same controlled slowness on an inhale. The rhythm paired breath and motion into a single continuous flow. Exhale and lift. Pause. Inhale and lower. Pause. You repeated this lift many times, the stone's weight a solid grounding presence in your hand, its coolness gradually warming to match your skin. The exercise generated a deep, localized warmth in the upper arm, a focused heat that was different from the diffuse hum of the squats, and you paid attention to the way the muscle hardened and softened with each repetition. After a series with the right arm, you switched the stone to your left hand and began again, noting the slight difference in strength and coordination, the left arm requiring a little more focus to keep the motion smooth. The stone surface was smooth except for a few tiny pits, and your thumb traced these unconsciously as you worked, a small tactile anchor that kept your mind present. When both arms had completed their sets, you set the stone down on the sand with a soft thud, and it sat there like a faithful companion, a grey oval that had travelled from some distant river to assist in this quiet morning ritual. A slow circle walk followed the arm lifts. Your feet were tracing the same meandering path they had taken before, and you used the walk to observe the chamber with a leisurely, undirected attention. The torchlight on the pillars was as steady as it had been all morning, the flames holding their shape without wavering, and the shadows they cast were deep and soft-edged. The pillars themselves were constructed of the same grey tufa as the walls, their square shafts rising to meet the wooden beams of the ceiling, and at the base of each pillar a small drift of sand had accumulated, blown there by the faint drafts that you could never quite feel. The ceiling beams were massive, dark with age, and the smoke of long extinguished torches, and they ran in parallel lines toward the far wall, their undersides showing the adze marks of the carpenters who had shaped them. High above those beams, the floorboards of the arena sealed the space from the open sky, and you thought of them now as a great lid holding in the quiet, a barrier against the noise and light that would later fill the seats above. The thought passed through your mind like a cloud, leaving no trace, and you returned your attention to the walk, the steady, rhythmic pad of your bare feet on the sand. The next exercise was a simple press, lifting the stone from shoulder height to full extension overhead, and you retrieved the same river stone and held it at your shoulder with both hands before beginning the movement. You pressed it upwards slowly, the arms straightening until the stone was above your head, and you held a position for a breath, feeling the engagement of the shoulders and the upper back before lowering it back to the starting point with control. The motion was repeated many times, each press accompanied by the same paired breathing. Exhale as the stone rose, inhale as it descended. You then varied the exercise by holding the stone at your chest and pushing it straight outward in front of you, a horizontal press that engaged the chest and the fronts of the shoulders, and you held the extension for a slow count of 3 before drawing it back in. The stone seemed to grow a little lighter with each set, a sign that the muscles were warming and the neural pathways were settling into the pattern, though you were never working hard enough to fatigue. The goal was maintenance, not exhaustion, and you kept the effort well within the bounds of comfort. When these presses were done, you returned the stone to its place by the wall, nestling it among its companions, and you brushed the sand from your palms with a few light claps. Now you stood in the center of the soft sand area and prepared for the final part of the conditioning, a slow stretching sequence that would bring the work to a close. You reached both arms overhead, interlacing your fingers and turning the palms upward toward the dark ceiling, and you stretched upward with a long, luxurious extension, feeling the ribcage lift and the spine elongate. The stretch pulled gently through the sides of the torso, the intercostal muscles spreading, and you held the position while taking 3 deep breaths, each inhale seeming to add a tiny increment of length. Then you released the hands and let the arms float down, and you bent forward from the hips, allowing the spine to curl one vertebra at a time until your hands dangled near the sand and your head hung heavily. The backs of your legs sent a mild, welcoming pull upward, and you relaxed into the stretch, letting gravity do the work while your breath flowed freely. You swayed slightly from side to side, a tiny pendulum motion, and the sand beneath you was a pale blur, the lamplight catching the individual grains in a soft shimmer. After a long, timeless pause in the forward bend, you bent the knees and rolled up slowly, stacking the spine again until you stood upright. The blood receded from your head, leaving a slight lightness, and you placed your hands on your lower back, pressing the hips forward to open the front of the body. The stretch sequence continued with a gentle twist to each side, your arms floating out and your head turning to look over the shoulder, the spine rotating smoothly, and you held each twist for several breaths before returning to center. The twists released the small muscles along the spine, and you felt a pleasant loosening in the mid-back, a subtle freedom that had not been there when you started. At last, you returned to a simple standing position, feet hip-width apart, arms at your sides, and you closed your eyes. The body felt settled, warm and open, the muscles humming with a low, contented energy that was more relaxation than effort. The sweat on your skin had cooled and was now just a faint moisture, the damp air of the chamber having done its work, and you stood in the silence, letting the minutes pass unmeasured. The only sounds were the steady hiss of the oil lamps and the soft, distant creak of the sandbag as it turned on its rope, a sound so familiar it had become a part of the silence itself. Your breathing had slowed to a resting pace, each breath a deep, even tide that barely stirred the air, and your mind was quiet, emptied of any thought beyond the immediate sensation of standing in the lamplit dark. Time, which had been marked earlier by the count of drills and the rhythm of breath, now dissolved into a single continuous present, and you had no sense of how long you stood there with your eyes closed, only that it was long enough for the body to fully absorb the work it had done. When you eventually opened your eyes, the chamber looked exactly as it had, the lamps burning, the pillars solid, the sand marked and peaceful. The conditioning was complete, and you felt a quiet readiness for whatever the rest of the morning would bring. You walked back to the bench where your sword and shield lay waiting, and you picked up the cloth to wipe your face one last time, its linen soft and cool against your skin. The exercises had been a form of rest in their own way, a slow, repetitive attention to the body that allowed the mind to drift and settle, and you were grateful for the time you had spent with the stone and the sand. The training posts stood in their row, the sandbag hung motionless, and the chamber enfolded you in its perpetual, patient stillness. You were no longer the one who had walked through the empty streets hours ago. You were now a more settled version of yourself, attuned to the quiet rhythms of the underground, and you were content to simply be here, breathing, waiting, present. The first sign was not something you saw, but a subtle shift in the texture of the darkness itself, a thinning at the edges of perception that made the shadows seem a fraction less dense. You had been standing with your eyes closed after the final stretch, your body balanced and still, and when you opened them, the chamber appeared unchanged, the lamps burning in their niches, the pillars solid, the sand marked with the footprints of the morning. Yet something had stirred at the far boundary of the space, a presence that was not quite light, but the promise of light, and you turned your head slowly toward the eastern wall where a narrow iron grate was set high near the ceiling. This grate was rectangular, perhaps the length of your forearm in each direction, and it served as the only direct connection between the underground training chamber and the open air above. Through its thick bars, which were rusted to a dark brown and spotted with the pale green of old copper, the world outside had always been visible as a patch of sky or stone, and now you noticed that the absolute blackness that had filled the grate all morning was no longer absolute. A faint greyness so pale it was barely more than a suggestion had begun to seep through the openings, and you stood still, watching it with a quiet, patient attention. The greyness did not rush or flood. It accumulated the way dew gathers on a blade of grass, imperceptibly at first, then in increments so small they could not be measured. You walked a few steps closer to the wall beneath the grate, your bare feet silent in the sand, and you tilted your head back to look up at the rectangle of slowly changing sky. The bars divided the view into segments, and each segment held a slightly different shade of the same deep grey. The center squares just a shade lighter than those at the edges. The stonework around the grate was rough, the blocks uneven, and a thin crust of mineral deposit from centuries of seeping rainwater traced white lines down the wall below the opening. As you stood there, your breathing slow and regular, the grey continued its patient transition, and you became aware of the first tiny movements within the light. Dust motes, suspended in the air, were beginning to catch the faint illumination and glow like particles of pale gold. They drifted in slow, lazy spirals, rising on currents you could not feel, and their motion was so gentle that it seemed they were swimming rather than falling. You watched a single mote as it floated upward past the bars, disappeared into the darker stone, and then reappeared a moment later, still climbing, still unhurried. The dust had been there all along, of course, invisible in the lamplight, and now the new day was revealing it, layer by layer. A quiet unveiling of the chamber's hidden life. The light through the grate was not yet bright enough to cast a defined patch on the sand. It was still a diffuse radiance that simply softened the darkness in that corner of the chamber, making the shadows less absolute and the outlines of the stone blocks more distinct. You noticed that the wall beneath the grate, which had been a uniform dark grey all morning, now showed its true colour, a warm sandy brown, and the texture of the chisel marks on each block was becoming visible, long parallel grooves that caught the light in thin, shining lines. The mineral deposits gleamed faintly, and a small cobweb that you had never seen before appeared in the upper corner, its silk threads strung with tiny beads of moisture that sparkled like a string of imperfect pearls. The web was old and abandoned, its maker long gone, and it trembled slightly in a draught that you still could not feel, a movement so slight it might have been the vibration of your own pulse in your eyes. You lowered your gaze to the sand at your feet, and there too the light was beginning to make a difference. The grains, which had been a dull grey-brown, now showed flecks of quartz and mica that twinkled faintly as you shifted your weight, a subtle glitter that was not dazzling but soft, like the first stars appearing in a twilight sky. The footprints you had left during the drills, which had been simple depressions, now had edges that caught the light and threw tiny shadows, giving them a new depth and clarity. You stood there for a long while, your neck slightly craned, your hands resting loosely at your sides, letting the gradual brightening wash over you without expectation. The lamplight, which had been the sole illumination for hours, now seemed warmer and more golden in contrast to the cool grey of the outside light, and the two sources met in a gentle gradient across the chamber, the lamplight dominant near the niches, and the dawn light growing stronger near the eastern wall. The merging of the two created a quality of illumination that was unique to this hour, a soft, layered glow that seemed to thicken the air and make the space feel even more enclosed, more sheltered. You breathed in, and the air tasted the same as before, cool and faintly mineral, but now it carried a slight freshness, a hint of the outside world that had not been present earlier. It was the scent of damp stone, warmed by the first touch of the sun, the smell of dew evaporating from the cobblestones in the street above, and perhaps a trace of green from the distant hills beyond the city walls. The scent was so faint that you might have imagined it, but it lingered in your nostrils and gave the moment a quiet, expectant quality. Then, cutting through the deep silence, came a sound. It was distant and muffled, travelling down through the stone and the earth and the heavy floorboards, but it was unmistakable, the crow of a rooster, somewhere above and to the east where the first light was now touching the rooftops. The crow was not loud or sharp. It had been softened by the layers of architecture until it was little more than a suggestion. A brief, hoarse call that rose and fell and then vanished into the stillness. You listened, and after a long pause the rooster crowed again, a second call that was identical to the first, and then silence returned. The sound hung in your memory like a gentle bell, a marker of the hour that required no response. Somewhere in the city, the bakers were stirring, the shopkeepers were opening their shutters, the carters were harnessing their mules. But here in the underground chamber, all of that activity was reduced to this single, softened voice, and you accepted it as a quiet herald of the day's beginning. You did not move or hurry. You simply noted the rooster's call and let it pass, your attention returning to the light. The light was now strong enough that a pale rectangle began to form on the sand directly beneath the grate, a shape defined by the pattern of the iron bars. It was a shadow and an illumination at once. The darker lines of the grate's crossbars painted on the golden sand in soft, blurry strokes, while the open spaces between them let the light fall freely. The rectangle moved almost imperceptibly as the sun continued its climb beyond the reach of your sight, shifting its position by a fraction of a finger's width every minute, a slow crawl that reminded you of the shadow on a sundial. The pattern of the grate on the sand was crisp at its center and soft at its edges, and within the bars of light the dust motes danced more thickly, a concentrated swirl of tiny bright specks that rose and fell in slow, tangled paths. You lowered yourself to a crouch, and then to a kneel, your knees pressing gently into the cool sand, and you extended a hand into the rectangle of light. The warmth on your skin was immediate and gentle, a pale sunbeam that had traveled millions of miles to touch the back of your hand, and you turned your palm upward, letting the light pool there like a tiny cup of gold. The contrast between the warm light on your palm and the cool air on the rest of your skin was a delicate, pleasant sensation, and you held the position, watching the way the light outlined the fine hairs on your fingers and the small creases in your skin. The hand that held the practice sword, the hand that had thrust and cut and parried all morning, now rested in the quiet benediction of the new day, and the sight was a soft reminder of the world outside that would soon call you back to its surface. You rose from the kneel, your knees brushing the sand from your tunic, and you walked slowly back to the center of the chamber. The lamplight seemed to be receding now, not in brightness but in importance, yielding its dominance to the cool grey light that was filling the space from the eastern grate. The shadows behind the pillars were no longer black, but a deep charcoal, and you could see details that had been hidden, the grain of the wooden ceiling beams, the iron rings set into the walls for tethering, the small cracks in the stone floor where the sand had sifted down over the years. Another sound reached you, this one even fainter than the rooster, the creak of a cartwheel, somewhere in the streets above, a slow, rhythmic groan that spoke of a heavy load and a patient ox. The sound was so distant that it might have been a memory rather than a present noise, and it faded in and out as the cart moved along some unseen street, its wheels turning with a steady, unhurried pace. The creak was a familiar sound, part of the morning symphony of the city, and you listened to it the way you might listen to a distant stream, an element of the background that required no attention but which enriched the silence. The cart passed out of earshot, and the quiet returned, deeper than before. You picked up the practice sword from the bench where it had been resting, its oak blade cool to the touch, the leather of the grip still holding a faint warmth from your earlier use. You did not put on the shield. You simply held the sword in your right hand and let it hang at your side, the tip pointing down toward the sand. Then you walked to the patch of light that had now grown large enough to accommodate your full height, a rectangle perhaps 2 strides wide and 3 long, its edges still soft but its center bright. You stepped into the light and felt it on your shoulders and the top of your head, a gentle warmth that was more a presence than a temperature, and you turned to face the training post, which now stood half in shadow and half in the pale dawn glow. The scars on its surface were more visible than they had been all morning, each dent and scrape picked out by the angled light, and the wood showed its true color, a warm honey brown with darker streaks where the grain had tightened around old knots. You raised the sword slowly, your arm moving through the now familiar path, and you performed a few slow thrusts into the illuminated patch of air, the wooden blade cutting through the dust motes and sending them spinning. Each thrust was a quiet, deliberate motion, the sword tip coming to rest at the exact distance where the post would have been if you had been standing closer, and you held the extension, watching the way the light outlined the edge of the blade and revealed the fine scratches left by countless practice sessions. The thrusts were not part of a drill. They were a farewell, a quiet acknowledgement of the morning's work, and you performed perhaps a dozen of them, each one slightly different in angle or speed, before lowering the sword and letting it rest in the sand. The light from the grate was now bright enough that you could see the colors of things clearly: the warm amber of the lamp oil, the dull red of the clay water jug on the bench, the pale cream of the linen cloth draped beside it. The shadows had softened, and the chamber felt less like an underground cavern and more like a room lit by an early morning window, still dim but no longer secret. The air had changed too, its coolness now carrying a faint suggestion of the warmth to come, a hint that the sun was fully above the horizon and beginning its slow climb across the sky. You walked to the bench and set the sword down, then lifted the water jug and poured a small amount into the cup. The water was still cool, and you drank it slowly, tasting the faint clay flavor and the freshness of the distant springs. The cup made a soft clink as you set it back on the stone, and the sound echoed gently in the now less dense silence. You noticed that the hiss of the lamps seemed louder now, perhaps because the outside noises had begun to compete with it, or perhaps because the chamber's acoustics had shifted subtly with the arrival of the light. Whatever the reason, the silence was no longer the deep, absolute stillness of the night. It was now a morning silence, a quiet that held within it the seeds of the day's activity, the rustle of waking animals and the first low murmurs of human voices beginning to stir in the streets above. A third sound penetrated the chamber, the distant muffled thump of a wooden shutter being opened, then another and another, as the shops and apartments around the arena began to greet the day. The sounds were soft and rhythmic, a pattern of light impacts that traveled through the stone like a gentle percussion, and they were followed by the faint, barely audible murmur of voices, too far away to distinguish words, but close enough to sense the cadence of conversation. Someone laughed. A brief, bright sound was swallowed almost immediately, and a dog barked twice, then fell silent. These were the sounds of the city waking, the ordinary music of a new morning, and they filtered down through the grate and the stone like the light itself, soft and undemanding. You stood with your hands resting on the bench and listened, letting the sounds wash over you, and you felt a quiet sense of connection to the world above, a world that had been distant and abstract during the hours of darkness, but was now becoming real again. You thought about the other gladiators, still asleep in the ludus, their breathing continuing in the dim cell, and you imagined them beginning to stir as the light reached their high window. The same light that now fell on your hands would soon fall on their faces, and they would rise and dress and make their way to the training ground, finding the sand already marked with your footprints. The thought was not a lonely one. It was a quiet recognition of the shared rhythm of the school, the cycle of sleep and practice that bound you all together, even in silence. You would see them later, in the full light of day, and you would work alongside them, but for now you were still the only one awake in this underground space, and that solitude was a gift you did not wish to end too quickly. You lingered by the bench, drawing out the final moments of the session, your eyes moving slowly over the chamber, the training posts standing in their patient row, the sandbag hanging motionless, the pillars solid and ancient, the lamps still burning though their light was now almost redundant. The grate above continued to brighten, and the rectangle of light on the sand had shifted a little further, its edges now sharply defined, its warmth more pronounced if you stepped into it. The dust motes had thinned as the outside air began to circulate more freely, and the cobweb in the corner was now fully visible, a delicate lacework that trembled in the faint breeze of the new day. At last you accepted that the training session was reaching its natural end. The feeling was not one of conclusion, but of gentle transition, the same quiet shift that had carried you from the ludus to the street, from the street to the passage, and from the darkness into the light. The morning had done its work, and you had done yours, and the two were now in harmony, aligned like the balance of a well-made sword. You lifted the practice sword one final time, not to strike but simply to hold it, feeling its weight and its history, and then you laid it gently back on the bench beside the shield. You folded the linen cloth into a neat square and placed it next to the water jug, and you looked around the chamber one last time, committing it to memory even though you would return the next morning and the morning after that. The chamber would wait for you, as it always did, its lamps burning and its sand ready, and you would return to it when the night had passed and the streets were empty again. For now, however, the day was calling, and you were ready to answer. You turned away from the bench and walked slowly toward the arched entrance, pausing once to glance back at the grate and the pale light that now filled the eastern corner. And then you stepped into the vaulted corridor, leaving the training chamber behind, but carrying its stillness with you as you began the ascent toward the waking city. The practice sword lay on the wooden bench where you had placed it after those final, slow thrusts in the dawn light, and you stood beside it for a moment, letting your breathing settle into the quiet rhythm that had accompanied you all morning. The chamber behind you was no longer the sealed, lamp-lit sanctuary it had been when you first entered. Now the pale rectangle of light from the eastern grate had broadened and softened, mingling with the steady glow of the oil lamps to create a gentle, diffused illumination that reached even the far corners. The training posts cast long, faint shadows across the sand, and the sandbag hung in its usual place, motionless except for an almost imperceptible sway that was more a memory of movement than movement itself. The air, still cool, had taken on that slight freshness you had noticed earlier, and with it came the distant, muffled sounds of the arena above beginning to stir. You reached down and picked up the sword, cradling it in both hands, and you turned it over to inspect the blade one last time. The oak was smooth and warm from your grip, the grain polished to a dull gleam where your palm had held it, and a fine layer of sand dust clung to the surface near the tip where it had rested on the ground. You walked the few steps back to the equipment rack, your bare feet pressing into the sand with a soft, familiar crunch, and you selected the same clean cloth you had used earlier, now folded neatly on the shelf below the rack. Shaking it open, you began to wipe down the sword with slow, methodical strokes, starting at the hilt and working your way to the tip, turning the blade over to clean both sides. The cloth slid along the wood with a gentle hush, picking up the dust and the faint traces of oil and sweat, and you paid careful attention to the groove where the blade met the crossguard, a small crevice that often collected debris. When the wood was clean and its subtle luster restored, you folded the cloth and set it aside, then slid the practice sword into its designated slot on the rack, the one you had taken it from hours ago. The sword settled into the notched crossbeam with a soft click, its hilt extending outward in a neat line with the others, and you let your fingers rest on the pommel for just a moment before withdrawing your hand. Beside the swords, the wicker shield still sat where you had leaned it against the bench, its curved face turned outward. You lifted it, feeling the lightness of the woven willow, and you carried it to the shield rack, a series of pegs set into the stone wall. The straps were still damp from your arm, and you loosened them fully, drawing out the leather laces until they lay flat, then hung the shield by its top edge on an empty peg. The wicker rustled softly as it settled into place, the rawhide binding at the edges brushing against the wood of the rack. You adjusted it so that it hung straight, its front facing outward, and then you stepped back, your eyes traveling along the row of shields, each one slightly different in shape and wear, each one a silent record of its user's practice. Yours was the one with the darker patch of repair work in the upper left corner, and you noted its position, a quiet marker of your presence in this underground space, before turning away. The training posts stood in their patient row at the far end of the chamber, the center post bearing the fresh, shallow marks of your morning's drills among the many older scars. You walked over to it, the sand cool under your feet, and you placed your palm against the wood one last time. The surface was still faintly warm where your repeated strikes had raised its temperature, and you felt the rough grain under your hand, the small splinters that had lifted and been worn smooth over time. The post was, as always, completely silent, and yet it seemed to communicate something, a steadiness, a permanence, a willingness to stand and receive whatever was given. You patted it once, a soft, soundless gesture, and then you turned and walked back toward the bench near the entrance where the stone water basin rested on a low pedestal. The basin was a simple rectangular trough carved from a single block of tufa, its interior worn smooth by years of use, and it was filled with cool, dark water that had been drawn from the same aqueduct source that fed the street fountain. The water's surface was perfectly still, reflecting the lamplight and the growing daylight in a single unbroken plane, and as you leaned over it, you saw your own face looking back at you, indistinct and shadowed. You dipped both hands into the water, feeling the coolness close over your skin, and you rubbed your palms together, working away the fine grit of sand and the slight tackiness of the sword grip. The water swirled gently, tiny ripples distorting your reflection, and you scooped up a handful to splash onto your face. The coolness was a shock and a refreshment, washing away the thin layer of dried sweat and leaving your skin feeling clean and awake. You repeated the splash several times, each one a small, quiet ritual, and then you reached for the folded linen cloth on the bench and pressed it to your face, drying your cheeks and forehead and the back of your neck. The cloth was damp now and would need to be hung to dry, which you did, draping it over the edge of the bench so that it would be ready for the next session. The water in the basin slowly stilled again, and you looked at it for a moment longer before turning away, your hands cool and clean, your face tingling slightly. Above you, the first clear sounds of human activity began to resonate through the stone. A heavy door slammed somewhere in the distance, a low, percussive thud that rolled through the undercroft like a single beat of a great drum. Footsteps followed, hard-soled sandals on flagstones, moving in a rhythm that spoke of purpose and routine. The arena attendants, arriving to unlock gates and sweep the passageways that led to the seating tiers. You stood still and listened, tracking the sounds as they multiplied and diverged. One set of footsteps passed directly overhead, the pressure of each heel sending a tiny, muffled vibration through the wooden floorboards that sealed the ceiling, and you heard the scrape of a bolt being drawn back, followed by the creak of a heavy door swinging open. Voices now too distant and too blurred by the stone to be understood, but their cadence was unmistakable. A brief exchange between two men, a question and an answer, the tone unhurried and ordinary. The words merged into a gentle murmur, a background noise that was as natural as the sound of the lamps, and you found it comforting rather than intrusive. A sign that the world above was waking on schedule, that the day was unfolding as it always did. Somewhere, a broom began to sweep, the stiff bristles hissing across stone in a slow, regular rhythm. Swish, pause, swish, pause, swish, pause. The sweeper was methodical, clearing the passage of the dust and debris that had settled overnight, and you could track his progress by the gradual fading of the sound as he moved farther along the corridor. None of these noises entered the training chamber itself. They remained outside, in the vaulted passage and the stairwells, and the sand around you absorbed them into its quiet, holding the chamber's peace intact, even as the building came to life. You crossed to the bench and retrieved your sandals, which still sat side by side where you had left them, the leather straps coiled loosely. Sitting on the edge of the bench, you lifted one foot and began the now familiar process of fitting the sandals. The sole was cool against your bare arch, and you aligned your heel with the shallow depression that your weight had molded over time, feeling the leather conform to the shape of your foot. The straps passed between your toes and around your ankle, and you tied them with slow, careful knots, tugging gently to test the hold. The second sandal followed, and soon you were standing again, the slight lift of the soles separating you from the sand, the leather creaking softly as you shifted your weight. You adjusted the ties once more, ensuring no edge would rub, and then you straightened your tunic, pulling the wool fabric down so that it hung evenly over your hips. The tunic was creased from the hours of movement, a few small folds pressed into the weave, but it was clean and serviceable, and you wrapped it a little more closely around your body, feeling the familiar warmth of the wool against your skin. The underground air was still cool, but you knew that outside the sun was now fully risen, and the cobblestones would be warming, and the thought of that warmth was a quiet anticipation. You gathered the few remaining items, the water cup, which you returned to its place beside the jug, and the folded cloth that you had used to wipe the sword, which you tucked onto a shelf beneath the bench. Everything was now as it should be. Each object returned to its proper station, the chamber ordered and ready for the next morning. You took a final look around the space, your eyes moving over the training posts, the sandbag, the equipment racks, the pillars and the lamp niches with their small, steady flames. The lamps would burn until an attendant came to extinguish them or refill them, and their light would continue to hold the chamber in its gentle embrace, waiting for the next quiet hours before dawn. You felt a quiet gratitude for the space, a sense of shelter that went beyond the physical, and you nodded once, a small gesture of acknowledgement, before turning toward the arched entrance and stepping out into the vaulted corridor. The corridor was no longer empty. A few oil lamps still burned in their brackets, but their light was now supplemented by the grey daylight that filtered down the stairwells at either end, casting long, slanting columns of illumination that cut across the flagstones. The air in the passage was cooler than the chamber, with the slight draught that you had felt on your way in, and it carried the smells of the waking building, the dust raised by the sweeping, the faint tang of iron from the gate hinges, and a distant whiff of fresh bread that had somehow made its way from the bakery you had passed earlier. You began to walk toward the upward ramp, your sandals tapping softly on the worn stone, and you encountered no one. The footsteps and voices you had heard remained just out of sight, around corners or behind doors, and you moved through the corridor in a bubble of solitude, a single figure in the vast awakening structure. The ramp rose before you, its slope gentle, its walls rough and cool, and you started the ascent with the same unhurried pace you had used all morning. The light grew a little stronger with each stride, the greyness brightening, and the air began to lose its underground chill, replaced by a fresher, slightly warmer current that flowed down from the open gate above. At the top of the ramp, the passage turned, and you saw the side gate ahead, the same one you had entered hours before, its iron ring handle dimly visible in the morning glow. The gate stood slightly ajar, as though it had been open since your arrival, and a sliver of bright daylight cut through the gap, painting a thin, brilliant line on the stone floor. You pushed the gate open with your palm, the hinges groaning once more in their low, familiar voice, and you stepped through into the open air. The transition was immediate and gentle. The cool, still atmosphere of the Undercroft gave way to the fresh, moving air of the street, and you stopped just outside the gate to let your senses adjust. The sky was now a pale, clean blue, the deep grey of the pre-dawn entirely gone, and a few faint wisps of cloud, thin as stretched wool, hung high above the rooftops. The sun had cleared the hills and was shining down into the street at a low angle, its light warm and golden, catching the edges of the buildings and casting long, crisp shadows that stretched across the cobblestones in the opposite direction. The stones underfoot, which had been cool and damp when you passed this way before, were now beginning to warm, their surfaces dry and faintly radiant with the absorbed heat of the early sun. The world felt open and airy, a direct contrast to the enclosed darkness of the chamber, and you stood still for a moment, breathing the fresh air and letting the sunlight fall on your face and shoulders. The street that had been so empty was now showing signs of life, though still quiet by the standards of the bustling hours to come. A few doors down, a baker had opened his shop, and the heavy wooden shutters that had covered the counter were now slid back, revealing an array of flatbreads and small loaves arranged on a stone slab. The baker himself, a man with flour-dusted arms and a cap of white cloth, was setting out a clay bowl of olives, and the smell of warm bread drifted toward you on the light breeze, rich and yeasty and deeply comforting. He glanced up as you passed, a brief, wordless acknowledgement, and then returned to his work. Across the street, a woman was unshuttering a small vegetable stall, setting out baskets of dark green leaves and pale bulbs of fennel, while her small dog curled at her feet, still half asleep. The dog's tail gave a single lazy thump against the stones as you walked by, but it did not raise its head. The sounds of the morning were all around now, but they were soft and scattered, the distant clop of a donkey's hooves, the creak of a cartwheel, the low murmur of two neighbors exchanging a greeting across a windowsill, the splash of water as someone emptied a basin into the gutter. A sparrow flitted down from a roofline and landed on the cobblestones ahead of you, pecking at some invisible crumb, before taking flight again. The city was waking gently, its rhythm still slow and unhurried, and you matched your pace to this rhythm, walking with the same steady, contemplative step you had used all morning. You turned onto the street that led back to the Ludus, the route you had taken in the deep darkness, and you found it transformed by the daylight. The narrow passage between the apartment blocks, which had been a corridor of pure black, was now a sunlit canyon, the high walls glowing in shades of ochre and cream. The shutters that had been closed were now open on some of the upper floors, and you could see glimpses of domestic life. A hanging basket of herbs, a red blanket airing over a sill, a child's wooden toy left on a ledge. The bakery with the rich scent was fully open now, and a small queue had formed. 2 women with baskets on their arms waiting patiently while the baker wrapped loaves in clean cloth. You passed the potter's shop and saw that the counter was now loaded with bowls and pitchers, their glazed surfaces shining in the sun, and the potter himself was visible in the dim interior, his wheel spinning with a soft hum as he shaped a lump of clay. The stray dog that had slept in the alley was now awake and sitting in a patch of sunlight, scratching its ear with a hind leg in a slow, contemplative motion. The fountain at the corner was running, the bronze lion's head spout pouring a steady stream of water into the travertine basin, and the sound of the water was a bright, musical note in the morning air. A woman was filling a clay jar, holding it under the flow with practiced ease, and she smiled faintly as you passed, a small automatic courtesy. As you walked, you became aware of the feeling in your own body, the physical residue of the morning's training. The muscles in your legs and arms carried a soft, pleasant weariness, the kind that comes from sustained, moderate effort, and your joints felt loose and well-oiled, moving through their full range without hesitation. The cuts and thrusts against the post, the slow shadow sparring, the deep squats and lunges, the lifting of the river stone, all of these had left a quiet imprint, a hum of readiness that was both relaxing and alerting. Your mind felt equally settled, the long hours of silent repetition having smoothed away any lingering restlessness or unease, leaving a calm, clear surface that reflected the morning like the still water in the basin. The world seemed to move around you with a gentle, benevolent order, and you were a part of that order, a single figure walking through the sunlit streets, carrying nothing except the memory of the dark, quiet chamber beneath the arena. The ludus appeared at the end of the street, its familiar facade of grey stone and small high windows coming into view as you rounded the last corner. The outer door stood open, and you could hear from within the sounds of the school beginning its day, the clatter of pottery in the kitchen, the voice of the cook calling out to an assistant, the distant thump of a practice sword against a post in the small courtyard where the other gladiators would soon be training under the open sky. The air near the ludus smelled of cooking porridge and wood smoke, a homely combination that greeted you like an old friend. You paused at the threshold, one hand on the doorframe, and looked back down the street. The arena loomed in the distance, its great oval form blocking a portion of the sky, and you could see the tops of the seating tiers catching the morning light, their travertine surfaces gleaming white and golden. The arena was still quiet, the crowds hours away, but it was no longer the silent, sleeping giant it had been when you descended into its depths. It was now a building awake, its attendants moving through its passages, its gates open, its sand waiting for the day's events. And beneath it, deep in the stone and the earth, the training chamber would still be glowing with the steady light of its lamps, empty and patient, holding the quiet you had left behind. You turned back to the open door and stepped inside. The corridor was bright compared to the pre-dawn darkness you had left, light filtering in through the open doors and the small windows of the upper floors. The smell of breakfast was stronger here, and you followed it toward the common room, where a few of the other gladiators were already gathering, their voices low and easy as they greeted one another. Someone called your name in a casual tone, and you raised a hand in acknowledgement, a small gesture that required no words. The bench where you had sat in the darkness was now occupied by a young trainee lacing up his sandals, and the door to your sleeping cell stood open, the straw mattresses inside rumpled and empty. The day had begun, and you were ready to meet it, your body awake and your mind at peace, the hours of solitary practice stored within you like a quiet fund of strength. You would eat, and you would talk, and you would train again under the sun, but somewhere beneath the stone, the chamber would wait, as it always did, for the next morning and the next, holding its silence and its lamplight for your return.